Evening, peeps. It says we're live. I'll believe it. Right, last week we were dealing with the first part of YEC, Young Earth Creationism, in that we were dealing with the age of the Earth. Is the Earth young? And we came to the conclusion that we could find no evidence that the Earth was young, but we had plenty of evidence that the Earth was old. And so this week is the second part of YEC. This is the creation part of it. Now, sadly, last week, Kevin Donohoe couldn't join us. Wave, Kevin. Show everybody who you are. Oh, Kevin.
I'm waving.
I don't. Yeah, there he is. That's Kevin Donohoe. He wasn't able to join us last week when it came to the age of the Earth. But Kevin is a petroleum geologist, and he relies on methods for basin modelling to help find hydrocarbon reservoirs, and that depends on absolute ages. So I was going to ask Kevin to give us a quick summary of why he is so sure those absolute ages and why those absolute ages are required, and then we can go into the creationism part of it. So off you go, Kevin.
Okay then, Fiona. Yeah, you dropped out just a bit there. You just, if I understand correctly, you just like to understand better why absolute ages are required in these sort of simulations?
And why you are so sure that you was correct.
Why I'm so sure that what? That they're correct? Yeah, you're dropping out, unfortunately. Can you hear me properly?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Okay, well, I think I got the gist of it. So, first of all, Basin modeling is a numerical simulation technique that fundamentally simulates basic physical processes in a sedimentary basin over time. And these fundamental processes are the deposition and compaction of sediments, the impact that compaction has on dewatering of the sediment, which is accompanied by reduction in pore space, which in turn is accompanied by changes in bulk thermal conductivities of the rocks, the rock fluid system actually, which in turn impacts temperature histories in the sedimentary layers in the basin, which in turn impacts petroleum histories in the basin. So it all comes back to the deposition and compaction of sediments in a basin over time. The simulation proceeds in time steps, and a necessary input to the simulation is the timing of deposition of each of the sedimentary layers in the basin and their current configuration. That current configuration is determined typically through seismic data, which petroleum geophysicists provide as input to the basin modeling simulation. Then the layers are initially decompacted according to simple physics. I mean, we know how compact a rock can get to depending on its grain size and grain type. We know how uncompacted it starts. For instance, what sort of porosity it has when the sediment is deposited. So it's a relatively simple matter to work out the physics of compaction of the sediment. And the simulation just proceeds through time, given the ages that the user provides. And those ages can be anything. They could literally be you could start with your grandmother's birthday and wind up with the present day. The software doesn't care. Mm-hmm. As it turns out, though, in short, the only simulations that produce temperature histories, pore pressure histories, vitrinite reflected histories, these are all things that can be measured in the borehole subsequently. The only simulations that produce matches to measured present-day values are those that employ absolute dating as applied to the geologic timescale. In other words, radiometric dates. That's the simple, hopefully fairly simple, short version of how this thing works.
Right. That makes sense. So that means that because the data that you get from a borehole using those dates matches what the model using those dates tells you, and knowing that your modelling is correct, then it leaves you no option but to say that those dates are correct.
That's correct. Now, a reasonable question might be: is this a non-unique solution? Are there ways to arrive at the same results using other input values, whether those be different ages or different heat flows, or whatever the case may be? And it's certainly true that that it is non-unique. There are a lot of variables involved in the basin modeling of sedimentary basins. However, age, and I shouldn't say age so much as the duration of the depositional event, and all the depositional events in the sedimentary basin has a primary impact on the simulation results. And so I listed several things that can be measured in the borehole. We have temperature, pressure, and this is per sedimentary layer, if you will. It's actually modeled layer. Temperature, pressure, something called vitrinite reflectance, which is a measure of the so-called maturity of organic material leading up to petroleum generation. Thickness of the beds, this is a very simple and primary thing that can be measured. And then ultimately, of course, is the petroleum fields themselves. Basin modeling is used to actually predict the location in time and space of petroleum fields. And so if the simulation matches a known field, or if it predicts a field that is subsequently drilled, then you know that the simulation reflects geological reality. And as I say, a primary component of that geological reality is the ages that are used for the deposition of those rocks. And this is brought home very simply by considering that a young Earth of 6,000 years is at 75 million% variance with an Earth that is 4.5 billion years old. So you would expect there to be some difference in physics as a result of trying to, for instance, trying to deposit 40,000 feet of sediment in the Anadarko Basin of Oklahoma and Texas in the space of a couple of months, as opposed to letting that take place over the entirety of the Paleozoic. In the former case, well, in the latter case, we get the temperature histories that we measure today. We get the petroleum fields that we have drilled and see today. In the former case, we're dealing with a 6,000-year-old Earth and 12 months of deposition of 40,000 feet of sediment. Then we get dramatically different temperature histories. We get sediments that are pushed through the petroleum generation window far too rapidly to produce the volumes and the distributions of petroleum that we see today. It is simply not possible.
Right. That's very interesting.
I realize I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but and you probably a lot of you have seen all of that written by me many times. But yeah, it's the only. I guess it's not the only. That we have the Oklo reactor is another very good example of the constancy of radioactive decay rates. But basic modeling certainly is one of the best, one of the few examples of that we have of decay rates being effectively constant at least out to the beginning of the Phanerozoic. And I limit it there simply because all the basin modeling simulations that I'm aware of have involved the Phanerozoic section, Cambrian to the present day. I'm sure that there's some folks who've done some work with the Precambrian as well. I'm just not familiar with that work and wouldn't want to make an overblown claim. So I guess I'll stick with the fact that the Earth is at least 540 million years old, and I think it's a reasonable to conclude that if the decay rates are good out that far, at least we know we don't have a 6,000-year-old Earth.
Right. So I mean that's a good way of reminding us what we discussed last week, and to then bring us to what we're discussing this week. So we are going with, we have an old earth. And now we're looking at the creationist side of the young earth, creationism. And we're going to concentrate on that from the young earth creationist perspective. I understand that there are old earth creationists out there. Much of what we say, I think, about special creation is going to be applicable to young and old, except when we talk about dates and time spans. But if we stick to young earth creationism, so we start off by deciding exactly what we mean in this discussion by creationism. And that is the Genesis account of the creation week. Now, that will allow us to include day age, but we're looking at mainly the literal 6-day creation just over 6,000 years ago, according to Bishop Ussher, etc. Now, with special creation, creatures and plants came into existence, fully formed, and it was done by God using his supernatural powers. And the mechanism, the only mechanism I've been able to get from anyone to this is that God spoke and that created. So by speaking, that is the mechanism. I can't get any other mechanism. I've never been told one. So we can't really go too much into comparing mechanisms. But what we can look at is, what would we expect to see and what do we actually see? And then we can also look at evolution, the theory of evolution, and why it is supported, why we claim it is supported by evidence. And there are many different strands on that. So, are we all happy with that definition of creation and creationism?
I'm good with it.
Yeah. Charge!
Right. So we're going with this, the special creationism. God spoke and everything came into existence in the order of Genesis 1 or Genesis 2. But we can start with that there is a difference in the order in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. In one version says that God created the animals so that man wouldn't be lonely. Man was already created. And the other version is that the animals were created first and then man. Now, that, I think, is Paul Hartley's area, possibly, in the mythology behind these events, and how it is a melding of two mythologies.
Just run that over again. Just a moment. I was just buggering around with trying to get myself back in black and white again. But I think I got where you were coming from. There are two stories. The way I've heard it explained is certainly within the mythology itself, is that the first story is all about, or the first version is all about how the Earth and the universe were created as a whole. And then the second account is all about how the Garden of Eden, and specifically Adam and Eve, were created. So first of all, it's talking about the world and the universe and everything, and then it's talking about just the Adam and Eve story. And then it tails off from that point just on the Adam and Eve story, and of course that then explains how there are other people for Cain and Abel to marry and all that kind of thing, because they were actually created in the first story and the second story is just the Adam and Eve thing. But yeah, there are certain parts of it that are completely back to front. I think it's animals and plants or something like that are back to front in one or the other. Straight off the top of my head, not really quite sure, but somebody will correct me.
Mhm.
I think if I'm
Right.
to speak just for a second or two before I've got to go back out to work, is that when you read in Genesis 1, it gives you like quite a comprehensive way it sets out how God created, not only the universe but life itself.
And Andy, I hate to break it off you, mate. It's only a page. It's not really comprehensive.
Yeah, okay, but it kind of gives us, well, I think it's a bit more than that actually, but it gives you kind of a not an overall view of how God actually created these things. We don't know actually how he created them, but it gives you like in an order. I think when you look into Genesis 2, it doesn't give you as big as it is in Genesis 1. It's an overall view, and yeah, it does miss out a few things, but I don't think that's detriment to, it doesn't conflict in any way, not in my thinking anyway. It doesn't conflict. But it just gives you an overall view, going over what it says in Genesis 1. Yeah, so that's what I get out of it when I read it.
There's a problem with that, and I took a look at this very carefully, and I'm just going to go and look this up again, so I can read it out. I'm just nipping to Bible Gateway, just so that I can get the orders. Okay, here we go. Right, now we've got, so we have day 5, we have the waters bringing forth various creatures and birds that fly above the earth, and whales and waterfowl, and that was the 5th day. And 6th day, let the earth bring forth the living creatures after his kind, and cattle, creeping thing, and beast of the earth after his kind. Next, and then on this, that's the sixth day. And then he said on the same day, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. And then God made man. Okay? So he made man after the animals, and for man to have dominion over the animals. When we go to Genesis 2, oh, for goodness sake. Where did it go? Right, that was that. Genesis 2, we've got the plants. And then it says, after mentioning plants, and says there was not a man to till the ground. And the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. And God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put man whom he had formed. And out of the ground God made to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight, good for food. The tree of life is also in the midst, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Okay, and that goes on, and then we come to where God's put man in Eden. And then God says, it is not good that the man should be alone. I will make for him an helpmeet. Next verse straight after it. And out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field and every fowl of the air, and brought them unto Adam to see what he would call them. And whatsoever Adam called every living creature, that was the name thereof. And Adam gave names to all cattle, and to the fowl of the air, and to every beast of the field. But for Adam there was not found an helpmeet for him. And the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and he slept, and he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh instead thereof, and the rib which the Lord God had taken from man made he woman, and brought her unto man. Now, it's not just a case in that of the order slightly different because it's a sort of summary. It gives a completely different reason for the animals. See, the animals were made to find an helpmeet for Adam, because God said it wasn't good for him to be alone. But no helpmeet was found amongst the animals, so then he made women. But Adam would not be alone if the animals were created first.
Oh, hush.
Yeah, so there's your problem there. If animals were created first, then this whole part of Genesis 2, that the beasts and the fowl were all made trying to find a helpmeet for Adam because God had said it wasn't right that he should be alone.
Biblical marriage. Okay, and the problem with that, of course, is that God created Adam. Full stop.
Mm-hmm.
Then we move on to the next bit, and then God decided to create animals to keep Adam company.
Mm-hmm.
Biblical marriage.
Yes.
Adam and Eve. And it's only on the next chapter that we get Eve. So, yeah. The next time, no, actually, it's the end of this one, but you hear about their adventures in the next chapter. So, yeah, the idea of biblical marriage, just as a little offshoot from where we are, I know we'll get swerved straight back in a minute. The God created Adam and Eve bit, no, he created Eve as an afterthought. He created animals first, and he gave him sheep and cows to name.
And right in there is the problem, because if it was all done in the order of Genesis 1, then this line of God saying it wasn't good for Adam to be alone isn't going to happen.
Because there'll be people around.
Well, because there would be the animals around, because he created the animals so that Adam wouldn't be alone, according to Genesis 2. But in Genesis 1, the animals were already there, so therefore God would not be saying he was alone. And this is why I don't think you can just say Genesis 1 tells you how it was done and Genesis 2 is just a brief summary. Because there is this mutually exclusive ordering.
Right. Sorry.
And another thing, you got in Genesis 1, you got vegetation, animals, Adam and Eve. All right, that took from the third to the sixth day.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in Genesis 2, you have Adam, vegetation, animals, and Eve, and this goes from the first, second, third, and fourth days.
Mm-hmm.
And the other one didn't start until the third day.
Yeah,
Third, fourth, fifth, and sixth days.
I think the other problem here, too, is that regardless of the reason for the two stories, I think, we always hear this.
Right. Kevin, thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
Yeah, it was my pleasure, Fiona. I'll hope to be able to participate longer at another time.
Oh, great.
We might still be around when you get back from the airport. We tend
when
to
your
go on a
mother-in-law's
lot.
ready to go, it's best to help her out the door.
Yeah.
No.
Does she know she's going to the airport?
Yeah. Well, that's what I've told her. That's where she's going.
Well,
Thanks for coming in.
Yep. Have fun. Thanks.
Thanks,
Kevin.
Cheers.
Sorry about that.
That's quite all right. Anyway, I was saying that even though we always hear this reasoning that there were two different stories told by two different people, so you're going to get, there's always going to be discrepancies or differences between the stories, and I'm okay with that in the sense that, yes, if Fiona tells a story and then I tell a story about the same event to somebody else, I may include things that Fiona didn't include. That's fine. I may exclude pieces that Fiona had in her story because my intent is different But what I can't do is you can't contradict facts that were established, details in the first story. You know, if Fiona says her jacket is red, and then I tell the story and I say her jacket is green, you can't attribute that to, well, it's just two different purposes to the story, because there's an established fact there. So when we talk about order, you know, of creation, you can't explain that away by simply saying that there were two different purposes to the story. Order is a specific fact. It either happened in that order or it didn't happen in that order. It can't be both ways. I think the other thing too with the Adam and Eve, I mean, the old explanation, of course, that I heard was the reason that Adam was created first is because God didn't want Eve chattering in his ear while he was working on Adam. But that's for another day.
There was one thing that got me, though. It said the animals were made to keep Adam company. Now, I have a problem with that because, okay, if you're going with a biblical God, he knows everything, so he's like, okay, I'm going to make a man. Of course, I'm going to make a woman. You know, I don't need these animals to keep him company. You know, I know what he needs, but whoever copied or wrote this down, maybe there was something missed in the translation from the original, from the Hebrew to King James Version and the modern day version. You know, the way it was worded, it's like, well, I made the animals and they ain't helping him out, so let's see here, what will we do next? You know.
Well, you've also got to bear in mind. Go on, sorry.
Oh no, that's all. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, you've also got to bear in mind that this God appears to be the ultimate absentee father. So basically, one day after creating man, what does he do? Oh, I'll just give him some shit to keep him company, and invents all the animals.
Yeah, I noticed you mentioned sheep first than the other one. I just wonder, though, if a lot was left in the translation that would have filled it out more and made it, probably make more sense, maybe.
Yeah, but it still leaves us a problem with these mutually exclusive orders.
Yeah,
well, I mean,
let's just go with the it got a bit garbled in the translation.
Well, isn't there? If I can ask, doesn't it seem painfully obvious to anybody else? I mean, not to you guys, but you know, that when you look at the story of Adam and Eve, right? Adam was created from the dirt, and then Eve was created from Adam's rib, right? I'm sorry, but to me, this screams of a nice bedtime story for children to explain why mommy loves daddy. This is all this sounds like. This sounds like a very simple, a childlike, kind of like the pelican bringing babies, right? The stork bringing babies. You know, this is just a nice explanation to explain why mom and dad love each other.
My understanding of it is it's more of a pygmy folklore. That's kind of where it comes from.
Yeah, I mean, there was really, I mean, it's the thing is, it's like a tribal story that's been passed down from generation to generation. The ancient Jews now reject this story, saying that it's ridiculous that apparently two humans, that recently through a bottleneck, the whole Noah thing being a real documentation of that shit actually going down, that it was able to produce us somehow. I mean, it's the whole thing is ridiculous.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an example of a tradition that's been taken way too seriously in our modern time. I mean, there's a bunch of mythological stories that a lot of us take it like to be superstitious, but with regard to this one, it just happened to have the one to win the sort of genetic lot.
Yeah, it's. I think it's. Well, let's put it this way. Let's try and get this one. We have the tortoise and the hare, and the hare was boastful about how fast he was, and he decided he was racing the tortoise. Now, can anybody remember who won the race?
Tortoise.
Right.
Right.
And he won the race because he used
slow and steady.
Yeah, and he used his brains.
You know, the rabbit stopped by the nearest bar and got smashed.
So, but the thing is, though, that teaches you a certain moral. But nobody actually thinks that a hare and a tortoise got together and had a race.
Right.
And yet, as soon as I bring it up, you're all familiar with that story. And you're all familiar with what that story is teaching. But you don't have to take it as a literal event.
Well, here's a question, Fiona, out of this Genesis, and I just noticed this, and it never really occurred to me before. It's in verse 20, and it says the man named his wife Eve because she was the mother of all living. She wasn't the mother of anything at that point. She didn't create anything. It was all there. She hadn't given birth. We haven't even had sex at this point, as far as the story goes. So again, how is she the mother of all living? I mean, in terms of Adam using that as a reason to call her Eve.
Because he couldn't know that.
Well, she wasn't. Yeah, I mean, right? He went to sleep. He yanked a rib out. There she was. Then he says, "Ooh, I named thee Eve because you're the mother of all living." The hell? He didn't even know what sex was. They hadn't had sex. He didn't even have belly buttons yet. Well, you know, this is just nonsense.
So then we also have to look at if everything was created fully formed, what evidence would we expect to see? And I would say that, well, you would say, theoretically, that you should not find any different types of creatures in the fossil record. But on a 6,000-year-old Earth, you wouldn't have a fossil record anyway.
That's very true.
Well, God created the fossils just to fool us.
Satan created the fossils.
If we just run with this, we would find evidence all the way back that everything was the same. And yet it obviously isn't. Now, one of the ways that the attempts to get round this is because if you remember, everything got drowned. And it was only representative of each kind that was taken on the ark. We still don't know what a kind is, so that makes it a bit awkward. But we don't find in the fossil record that everything has been static. There have been changes. We see the transitional forms. Now, I know that somebody's going to start screaming, no, we don't find a bird with half a wing. Well, that's because you wouldn't expect a bird with half a wing anyway. It seems that the transitionals that are being asked for, and we're getting into it now, heading towards evolution, is a crocoduck.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's all down to a complete misunderstanding of evolution.
That's just it. They expect something to prove evolution that will absolutely disprove it.
They set up their own criteria for what a transitional form is.
Yeah, it's a complete misrepresentation of the theory. Like, oh, how come a dog doesn't turn into a tree or a duck turn into a frog or some ridiculous nonsense? And it's like, the history of life is a many branch tree with organisms trying to become fit to their environment. Okay, it branches out, it diverges, but it's not like you'll see a literal organism form into something else that's already fit to something else.
It's nice to hear you a little more coherent this morning or this afternoon there, Wolf.
It's great.
Well, here's another, just a quick question, right? Now, and this is kind of a little bit jump forward from Genesis, but not much, and then jump back. So we talk about the Tower of Babel, right? So supposedly none of the world's languages existed until God just snapped his fingers and everybody spoke a different language, right? And the key piece here being that no one understood each other. which would imply that the original language, right, vanished, because then if no one understood each other, that language went away. So the first language couldn't have been Hebrew, okay?
I don't think they've ever claimed that.
No, but hang on. Well, those were biblical claims that I made, other than the language not being Hebrew. I just made that based on the fact that people still speak Hebrew, and according to the Tower of Babel story, no one understood each other, which would have meant Hebrew couldn't have survived from before Babel to after Babel. Otherwise, somebody there would have understood somebody else.
I think I know what you're saying, but
okay,
they don't speak biblical Hebrew. They haven't for thousands of years.
No. Okay, but let me finish where the point of this, and then maybe that'll make this clearer. Okay. So my point here being, when you look at Genesis again, especially when you look at like the subnotes, remember we said he called her Eve because she was mother of everything living? Okay. Well, that's because the word Eve is similar in Hebrew to the word for living. But Hebrew wouldn't have existed as a language at that point, even according to the Bible. So that makes no sense whatsoever. How would you explain that?
What I want them to explain is that whole Grand Canyon crap. So apparently,
all right, we can move on to the Grand Canyon.
I would really want to dig into this because, like, if they say, oh, there was a flood. I mean, look at that Grand Canyon. No, that's full of shit. Because gravitational forces through downflooding demonstrates that this occurs millions of years. You can't say that this thing happened in this little amount of time and produced that type of landscape. That's ridiculous. That's magic, and you know it's not true.
Well, they can say whatever they want. They just can't prove anything.
Exactly. I mean, the physics, it takes too long. That's literally millions of years.
Yeah.
Could we stay off Grand Canyons and floods tonight and stick to creationism? Because we did do a flood, and to be honest, I would like to revisit that one in the future with one of our geologists on board, if we can get Kevin Donohoe again another week to go through this. But if we can stick to creationism, because I think that there is just so much to discuss. It's so difficult to try and stay focused.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot out there.
Yeah, there's an awful lot, and I've got so many things just going into my head here.
ADD is a wonderful thing.
I got another one. I got another one. Why the hell is Adam so old? Like 950 years old? Is that it?
Well, not when he was created. They start his chronology from the time he was created, and then from that point he moved another 900 years.
Yeah, he actually lived to see about 8 generations or 9 generations.
Yeah, something like that.
Progeny.
Oh yeah. Great grandpa Adam, man.
Yeah.
Like go up and visit him at his house.
Yeah, I mean there are real problems there.
Fiona, was you going to go over Abiogenesis or anything like that?
Sorry?
Was you going to touch on Abiogenesis or anything like that, or is that for something else?
Oh no, I certainly wanted to touch on that at some point. I mean, maybe a wee bit later on.
Yeah.
Now, the difficulty with creationism in A Young Earthquake is that we just don't have the evidence, and in fact we have evidence which contradicts it.
They don't need evidence.
Because of the age of the Earth.
Yeah, I mean, so I agree with you, Fiona.
Yeah, but then we've got old Earth creationists. Now, they accept an old Earth, but they still would go with the creation, with the order of the creation story, that everything was produced fully formed, but that a day was actually an age.
Yeah, that's right. They say that the time, the day, on the 6th day, or eon, or epoch, or whatever you need it to, however long you need that period of time to be, that's what they claim.
Well, the thing that I think is interesting there too is, right, because we're using the same word, day, so let's just assume it means some time period, right? Mm-hmm. But, and you have to help me, Fiona, but when you look at the things here that are created on different days, between different days, those jumps are different time periods. It is not the same time period to go from plants to birds as it is to go from, bacteria to plants and so forth and so on. And yet we have the same word. So basically now it's sort of just this open-ended.
Yeah.
Yeah, whatever you need.
Yeah.
And another thing is where it says, where God was doing this. It says, "And the evening and the morning were the first day." And it says, I think he says that in each day.
Yeah.
Which, that's why I think the young Earth creationists are actually more consistent in their interpretation, because it does say that, and there's no way you can explain that away. Evening and morning, we know what that means, right? Sun, moon, whatever, rotation of the Earth. You can't make that into 1,000 years or 1,000,000 years. You just can't.
Yes.
And
but they're not
sorry.
consistent. Sorry, that's not consistency, because if you look at the order the stuff was formed, stuff on day 2 or 3 had to be created after some of the other stuff. Like you can't have the sun. You can't have plants and then create the sun, or you can't have, what I mean? Like this, it's not in order. There's no way life, the fossil record and history of the evolutionary story shows us that the way these things are listed in the book are wrong.
Yeah, but I think that's
around that.
But I think that is. I'm going to disagree with you there, and I'm going to disagree with you only to say that we interject that. So for the Christian, well, they're not.
How do we interject that, Carl?
What I'm saying is that when I say that they're consistent, I mean they take the Bible literally for whatever it says, regardless of how it disagrees with science, right? So it doesn't matter to them that from our perspective they're created out of order, because it's all miraculous. So if God can create it all anyway, then he could create it in any order he wanted to. A miracle's a miracle. If you're going to have one, you might as well have two. And so I'm just saying, at least in their own mind, they're being consistent in their interpretation.
I think you're giving them too much credit, though. I think you're giving them too much of a leash. I mean, if they're going to believe the story, then the story has to comport in some way to some sort of evidence or something.
Well, no, but that's the whole point. But they say that this is how God did it, and science is wrong. That's the whole point.
And then
the evidence.
There would have to be some sufficient empirical evidence that would make this consistent with reality. I mean,
the evidence is the beginning of. Oh, sorry. No, I was going to say the evidence is the beginning of Genesis. That's our evidence right there. Those verses at the beginning. Right. Yeah. Even before the sun was created, in verse 3 it says, "And let there be light, and there was light, and God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness." And then even here, he goes, "Called the light day, the darkness night, and there was evening, and there was morning the first day." Even even before the sun.
If that's true, then why did he have to go and create
it's almost like poetry or something.
Yeah, it is poetic. But if that's true, then why did he have to go ahead and create the sun again? Didn't he already do it once?
No, he said there was light, but no sun.
And then there was sun, but no stars.
So then you're calling what we understand a day something that isn't a day, because there can be no day on Earth without our sun.
Yeah, but I'm just going by how they worded this,
Yeah.
To kind of give the idea of a day.
I'm just not letting them get away with it.
I mean, for the fundamentalists to say that they have a better explanation for this through their religion, I mean, it better have some real good empirical evidence. Otherwise, they just have to remain in the faith position and deal with it.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah,
I mean, they're not.
I think that's difficult. They've taken a faith position, and rather than just admitting that this is a faith position, they have then tried to go about finding evidence for it.
Yes.
And cherry picking the evidence.
But no, it's not even as good as that. What they have to do to get their evidence is to bastardize science.
Which they claim is God.
Yeah.
They claim God inspired science, and yet they disagree with most of it.
But
How funny is that?
But the problem is that when they start to rewrite science to fit into the faith, and the only reason that they're rewriting it is to make it fit into the faith. They've got no evidence that the current science is wrong, except that it doesn't comport with their faith.
That's right.
Does anybody know?
They are putting their faith over and above the observations from what they are saying God created.
Yep.
Does anybody know in the creationist time scale where the Tower of Babel lies?
A couple hundred years in.
Fall and
it's a couple hundred years in.
Oh.
It's just after it's as far as I remember, isn't it after the flood? Because
yes.
Yeah.
I thought it was before.
No, it's
after the
flood. After the flood.
Because civilization had rebuilt itself.
Right. So it's not only after the flood; it's after the Earth has repopulated itself with human beings as well.
Yes.
So where is the flood? So here's the flood is at what point? About 2,000 years in?
20? No, it's not even that long. It's 5 or 6 generations into Noah, and then the flood. So it's not long.
1656, apparently.
What?
1656. 1,656 years from the creation of Adam.
Right.
To the flood.
Sounds about right.
Flood. Okay. All right. Now hang on. Okay. Now how far
generations
from the
are about 400 years.
But Paul gave us a figure for that the other week.
What's that?
Paul gave us a figure for this the other week.
I didn't hear. I'm sorry, I missed it.
It might have been in a number of generations.
Yeah, it's based on the number of generations that they held back.
What point are you trying to make, Carlton?
The point I'm trying to make, again...
Can we let Paul answer, please? This is the question
please, yes.
we still don't have an answer for.
Creation is apparently a Tuesday afternoon in August in 4,113 BC.
Okay.
Of course. I knew that.
I think I heard that in the cartoon.
Okay. So now here's my question.
Hang on a minute. Hang on. We're trying to get this number between the flood and the tower.
Yeah. Or the
that's
tower,
the one
really.
Paul gave us something for, either last week or the week before. Well, can you remember, Paul?
Not straight off of my head, but it will not be before. It'll be somewhere around about 1800 years after creation, because it was before Abram, and round about in the hole, wasn't it?
I'm sure you gave it a figure for the number of generations between the flood and the tower.
I think it was me.
Noah, okay, I got it here. This is JewishAnswers.org. Noah lived a very long time, 950 years. The flood occurred when Noah was 600 years old. In the year 656 since creation, Noah and the others left the ark the next year. The incident known as the Tower of Babel happened when Noah was 940 years old in the year 1996 since creation.
Oh, a bit out then.
Okay, so roughly 2,000 years in.
That's not adding up at all then, is it?
Well, Lamech...
paste the link.
Okay, wait a minute. There's two things I wanted to... Okay, so there's two things now here that are here. So the first one that I was going to say, but yours may be better, the first one to say is, if it happened roughly 2,000 years after creation, right? So roughly 4,000 years prior to today, right? Give or take. Do we not have extant language samples from that date or prior to that date written?
We have language going back more about 5,000 years before that.
Okay, so here's something that doesn't require radiometric dating. We can establish language and language patterns. So that in itself would seem to throw the chronology on its tail.
Of course it does.
But the other piece, though, that you mentioned is that Noah lived to be 900 and something years old, give or take, and that's when this happened?
50 years.
Okay, and then how old was he when the flood actually occurred?
600.
So how many years is that? 300 years, give or take?
350 years until his death.
Okay, so now what we're telling me is that in 350 years we took 8 people and populated the Earth. Any population geneticists in the room?
Yeah, that's not going to happen.
And then 300. There was the Tower of Babel was 11 years before he died.
Yeah, that's not with a bunch of jackrabbits. That's not going to happen.
Yeah,
there's a lot of quintuplets.
That's a lot of octoplets. And, yeah.
I'm sorry, Heavy, but there couldn't have been many gay people in that.
That's group. That's a lot of interest.
If you go by their chronology, there was actually 9, because apparently Noah's dad Lamech was really good at swimming, because by all accounts. Lamech lived to 777 years or thereabouts, but he was still alive after the flood.
Yeah.
Whoa!
Must be
water there.
Need to float for a year. That's pretty awesome.
Imagine all the barnacles stuck to his back.
I want to know how he avoided the sharks.
Just stood on the ducks. There were plenty of them.
Okay, so here's a number for you, Carlton.
Yes, sir.
It's in the link. The link that I put up there says the next important piece of information, we need average growth rate over those 339 years. This is what you were asking for.
Right.
Of course, we have no hard data, but worldwide, the average growth rate today is 1.14. Even smaller countries have some as high as 5. Next, we need a formula to calculate the initial base of the initial population of 8. Plugging in our own values, we get a number of, at the time of the Tower of Babel, there were over 920,000 people on the planet. So in those 339 years, they replicated to 920,000 people since the flood.
I'm not sure they could have done that with a 50% growth rate.
Yeah.
I did this once before, and I calculated. Yeah, it just doesn't work out. But I don't have that. There's a website actually to do that, to plug those values in. But still, yeah, that didn't happen. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And again, so I think that that's one of the things that always kind of frustrates me is you get somebody, they'll say, well, a Christian, they'll say, well, you know, what's your evidence against creationism? And I'm like, I don't even freaking know where to start.
Start with the Bible.
This is like, oh my God, I you know.
Start with the first chapter of the book. The first
any
book
verse
of
in the Bible, and there'll probably be a problem there somewhere.
Yeah. Just start with Genesis 1 and 2, and if they can allegorize it all away, then there's no need for the rest of the book.
I wouldn't say that.
Well, if you're talking about original sin comes from the garden. If the garden's an allegory, then how do you keep original sin around?
If that's getting us into
subject for another hangout.
So yeah, you're right. Sorry. Yep.
That
is
a subject for another hangout.
Yep. Okay.
Because I think the creationists, they are of the mind that if you throw out this literal creation 6,000 years ago, you throw out original sin and there is no point in the Bible. So in a way, you would be in step with those extreme fundamentalists.
I don't think so. I'm not in the either or. What I'm saying is, if you're looking at creationism, when you're looking at, if you have to take the first 2, 3, 4, 5, even after chapter 6, where you've got Noah and the flood, if you have to take all of that literally to prove your point, there's some real fundamental problems with just time frames. You don't even have to get into any science, just time frames.
What's Fiona, from a biologist standpoint, what do we know how long it takes currently? Right. I mean, my understanding here. I'm sorry, I'm fumbling a little bit. That in DNA replication, that there are telomeres that are there that protect the DNA strands, and that those get worn down over time as they reproduce. Is there a clock? Do we know the rate at which that degradation happens?
Basically, you'll probably be able to find it somewhere online. I don't know off the top of my head, but that is what determines the human lifespan.
Okay.
Yes. Once the telomere wears out, your cells won't replicate, and you basically die.
Yeah.
So, do we have any evidence in any animals, for example? Well, I guess we would in some animals. I mean, for a lifespan of 900 years, that obviously is significantly more than our best lifespan now by a factor of 10 almost.
Yeah.
Is there any can an argument be made that the creationists will say, well, for example, they will say, and this presents its own problems, but they'll say, well, before Noah's flood, we had this vapor canopy, therefore radiation from the sun was basically blocked out much better, therefore there was no
degradation.
That the degradation was much, much slower because there was that radiation mutated the cells basically and caused the rate that we currently have post-flood. But
the only problem with that is water doesn't block out radiation in any form. In spite what Ken Hovind says, there's no blocking of. You need lead. If it was going to be a barrier, it would have to be lead, not water.
Well, that's for gamma radiation. Or
it's
I don't know.
Or it's
that may not be true for alpha or beta radiation, though.
No, it all goes through. Water will not stop the radiation that destroys our cells. So none of it. Unless it's 1,000 miles thick.
The radiation,
the dark zone, and everything would be dead.
Yeah, the vapor canopy would have to be thousands, about 25,000 miles.
It's its own problems. I agree with you, Paul.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you have pressure problems, and we'd all die from nitrogen poisoning anyway.
Exactly.
Not to mention heat.
Yeah.
But that aside,
the other thing is that the telomere shortening's got bugger all to do with radiation.
Exactly.
Say that again, I'm sorry.
So that's a red herring.
Yeah, I mean, what is it? Folk like Carl Barr and his Creation Evidence Museum in Glen Rose, Texas. They're trying to answer this question, and they're buggering around with barometric chambers, and they're finding that if you sort of like put animals into this barometric chamber and ramp up the pressure in there to several times the atmospheric pressure. Well, no, they and just feed them pure oxygen. They seem to do okay.
Yeah, that's why whales are as big as they are, because they can be.
Yeah,
it's because the atmospheric pressure, the pressure down there is 3 or 4 times what it is up here, and if we lived down there, it would kill us. But there's reasons they're 80% fat.
Yeah, so I've totally lost where we are now. So
we're trying to
please, if we could stop chasing rabbits.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because we're going to end up down so many different rabbit holes.
We ended up there because we were trying to chase language back past the Tower of Babel, and we were trying to work out how it would actually be possible for a Jewish name to survive through basically the randomizing of all language.
Yeah. And that doesn't make sense. That using Occam's razor, you would say the best explanation is that it is a story that's made up. It's post hoc.
Yeah, and at first glance, when you read Genesis 1, the beginning Genesis 1, it's a great read. The way you read it. Don't look at the science of it or anything like that. Just in the reading of it.
It's very
really,
poetic.
Really yes, very much.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't read it without images jumping through your head. You're right. It's a well-written document.
Mm-hmm.
Even if they miss the bits about apples out of the first chapter.
Yeah. One of the arguments that you will get from many of the young Earth creationists is that if evolution actually happened or happens, then what's the point?
And these are usually pointless fucks that are coming out with that, but carry
on. Because in order to keep their creation faith, they'll happily throw out much of the science that backs evolution. I'm going to say right here, evolution, it is a process. It happens and it is observed happening. Evolution is defined as the change in allele frequencies within a population over time. And the theory of evolution is the mechanism by which that process of evolution comes about. So you have to keep it in your mind. Evolution is a process, and we can observe it. The theory of evolution is the mechanism which explains how evolution, the process, is achieved.
Oh, like natural selection and stuff.
Yeah.
Okay.
So your mechanism is natural selecting acting upon genetic variation within a population. And that genetic variation within a population is a natural result of the way that our DNA replicates. And that it isn't perfect. We suffer from mutations quite often. And each individual has at least 130 mutations unique to them that neither of their parents have. So it's that variation that natural selection acts upon, and that is the mechanism by which allele frequencies within populations change over time. So keep that distinction in your head between evolution and the theory of evolution. Because I am sick to the back teeth of, well, if it's so well supported, why is it only a theory? It's not, it's a bloody process.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we have to keep in mind.
It's like theory is one of the highest levels of something. Forget what you call it.
If you think of it this way, you know how you can say, well, in theory, this is what should happen, but in practice, it happens a different way. That's the way theory is being used in science. Because that's the theoretical side, and then you get the actual observational side. Okay? And for some reason, creationists do not want to accept these definitions. And the reason is because we finally got through to them. The evolution is a process, and it is observed. We can study it happening. And that is why I honestly think, to save face, they've then invented microevolution and macroevolution.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Because they cannot deny that evolution is happening and we observe it happening.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, artificial selection, antibiotic, pesticide resistance, these are examples of natural selection in action.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think, Fiona, you certainly hit the nail on the head there. I mean, this is one of the things that I get. What grinds my gears, as Peter Griffin might say, is when I see people from the creationist camp who certainly, without doubt, know better. They either have degrees in the sciences somewhere, or they have been told repeatedly, or by some other means. They know that what they are doing is blatantly misrepresenting the concepts, and they are doing it in a public venue where the people do not have the background or the education to call them on it, because they know they can get away with it there. To me, this is the ultimate in dishonesty, and this is coming from the supposed Christian camp and the Christian right. When, like you said, when you talk about speciation, we have observed speciation. That's what macroevolution is. It's change between species, from one species to another. We have observed speciation. The problem is that's where we get kind from now. That's the next step. So now we can't argue with that because we can demonstrate it. So now we invent this thing called kind, which is at a higher level than species. And then we say to people who don't understand what's going on, oh, well, evolution says that things evolve from one kind to another. No, it doesn't. Stop right there. That's not what it says. We're talking about between species. They don't go from one family to another family overnight in a single generation. But people don't understand that, and so they use the word kind, and it sounds reasonable. That's the problem. The people in the audience, it sounds, give them the definition, and the rest of the speech is perfectly logical.
Yeah. Well, they can't define it, and it is a biblical word, and that's why they use it. And they know they can't get it defined, so there's no reason to define it because it's in God's word.
Right, and it's just dishonest.
The reason that they have to use it comes right back to the flood again, because they're trying to cut down the number of animals that Noah had to take care of. Yeah. And feed and muck out and all the rest of it. And so this is why kinds has become very important to them. And they've put that at, Ken Ham has put it at the level of family. Yeah. Now remember that family is subdivided into genera. And then the genera are divided into species. So we're actually 2 up from species at that point. But that's quite a way to go.
If we were going to go at that level, I mean, humankind would be the same as orangutan kind.
I think it goes up another level from there still, doesn't it, Fiona?
Yeah, back to the common ancestor for man and apes.
Well, that's the problem. It goes to the hominids, and that
Noah
means,
was a Neanderthal.
Yeah, the problem with that means that all of the hominids descended from Noah and his clan.
Yes.
Because if they only took the archetypal kind on the ark, then the humans would have been the hominid kind. There'd be no need for anything else. That's a real problem. As soon as Ken Ham puts it at that level.
He made a jackass out of himself?
Sorry?
Yeah. He made a jackass out of himself?
Well, I don't know if you ever saw this one.
If words are right, then we're all a bunch of inbreds.
I don't know if you saw this one, Fiona, but I thought this was so cute. I had to send this to you. It's on the right there in the text.
Carlton.
No, but look at it. It's an acronym. Katy Perry claims orgasms feel good sometimes. That's kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species.
Excellent. Excellent. And Ken Ham has put the kinds at the family level.
You can kind of understand why Noah descended into alcoholism, where after the flood, when he realized that his wife was really an orangutan in a dress. Oh no!
That is why kinds are so important to them. But if you point that out, you'll be told that no, that's not a kind. It's such a slippery term.
Well, that's why they use it. They use it because they know it doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, so Ken Ham can say that it's at the family level. But then we'll have somebody else who's just finished arguing about there was only a representative of our kind on the ark, who will then go and say, if it's the same species, then it's not a different kind, and they'll take it back down to species level. So this term kind seems to wander all the way through that, depending on what argument an individual is making.
Yes.
So even one person will change the definition of kind to suit the argument, which is why for years we've been trying to nail down what a kind is, and we still don't have it nailed down, because nobody will nail it down.
No, of course not. There's too much money involved in it.
And that's the problem. So, how did we end up in kinds here? We were talking about evolution.
Well, actually, in Genesis,
we were
kind
talking about
is
Eve.
mentioned. Yeah, it was talking about God. Let's see. Oh shoot! I was just looking at the verse. Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds. The livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals according to its kind. Now that's from Genesis. Why did they? I'm curious about this. Why is it specified or said like that? You know, like reproduce according to their kind. I mean, I don't know why that was there, and that's probably one of the biggest problems right there. It's the way it's worded. So why was that included in something like that?
Well,
it's a very.
Why was it said that way?
Because the writers were ignorant.
I mean, it's a very vague term, and as far as science is concerned, it is so diluted of intellectual content that when compared to species, which is a working definition, kind seems vague and superfluous.
Well, see, this was written long before science or anything like that. It's just the way they put it in Genesis right there at the very beginning. Whoever wrote it said, basically reproduce according to their kinds. And I'm wondering why they said it that way. What was the reasoning behind that?
Because there was no such thing as species and genera and family. It hadn't been broken up like that until the 1700s with Linnaeus.
Linnaeus did it in the late mid 1700s, I believe.
Yeah, so there wasn't any formal kind of classification. So it was a kind of dog. It was. I mean, they talk about cattle there. I mean, in my book, I take the piss out of the fact that they constantly refer to cattle, and therefore God must really love cows, because he literally talks about them in every single chapter of Genesis, right? He talks about cattle in some way. However, that word cattle, actually, you realize, comes to mean sheep and goats as well. So cattle refers to any beast of the field kind of thing. And you've also got to bear in mind, any kind of livestock apart from chickens. And you got to bear in mind, and dogs, that at the time, and within the geography of where all this originates from, there weren't all that many species around. It's kind of desert mostly, or fertile crescent. But it's not like rainforests, Java, or deepest Africa. So they've only got a limited selection of creatures. So it's like a kind of creepy thing. It's
the sample size is very small, is what you're saying.
Oh yeah. It's very small, and of course that is how it all fits on Noah's Ark, because they don't perceive them to be millions of species.
That brings me to my next point.
Okay.
If you're talking about what they're calling macroevolution, we've got two problems here. Now, the first one is that it seems to me that when they say there's no evidence for a macroevolution, what they're expecting is to see what they're calling the macro change, but in a single generation.
Right. The mutated instantly.
Yes.
Like Pokemon.
Hyper-evolution, which goes from house cats, which are the small ones, to tigers in a leap.
And now the other
way around.
But the other problem with that, though, is that given the kinds on the Ark, this impossible macroevolution is then invoked to explain all of the variations that have arisen since the Ark.
Does the word absurd mean anything?
On one hand, what they're doing is they're claiming that the 6,000 years is not long enough to give you all of the variation that you see, but that 4,000 years is long enough.
And you've also got to bear in mind that a lot of these things were distinct only 100 years after the flood. So there are carvings in Egypt around about 100 years after when this flood supposedly occurred that show cats and show lions and show
Yes.
tigers in a form that we would recognize today.
Yes.
Domesticated cats, yeah.
Yeah, we could look at that and say that is a cat, that is a lion, that is a tiger. Those things are distinct from each other.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And so you've had this macro evolution.
Yeah, that has occurred
within 100 years.
Yes.
Wow, that's pretty efficient.
Yeah.
But 6,000 years isn't long enough.
No.
So there's an inconsistency. There is an inconsistency there in that argument. It strikes me as if it's a form of any port in a storm.
Sort of a form of what?
Any port in a storm.
Oh, any port. Yeah, I understand. Yeah, okay.
But going back to evolution, and I think this is going to take us into the realms of the natural versus supernatural. Now, and abiogenesis, because there has been a lot of work being done on abiogenesis via natural mechanisms. Because don't forget that abiogenesis is the point in time where the planet goes from no life to life.
That's right.
Okay?
Yeah.
Now, if you look at Genesis, there is the first description of some form of abiogenesis.
Right.
Okay? So I think we have to make the distinction between supernatural abiogenesis and natural abiogenesis.
Yeah, that would make sense.
Both of them are involving going from non-life to life.
Yeah.
So I think that we have to be careful that we maybe try and use that terminology, because I think it's important to recognise that even Genesis is describing some form of abiogenesis. And
yeah, of course it is.
Yeah, that's something that I think a lot of young Earth creationists haven't actually taken on board. Now, the current work, what they're looking at is it possible through purely natural mechanisms to form some sort of life? And they have to break that down into smaller chunks. And so they're looking at purely chemistry. Can the chemicals do this? And it doesn't matter if it's a scientist that puts the chemicals together in a test tube.
Right.
It's just, if those chemicals come together, can they do it? And I don't want to hear the argument, oh, well, it took an intelligent scientist to do that, therefore intelligence. Just don't even go there, right? Because that is a naughty step and a spanking. Right?
That's sort of like, Shanna kind of made that kind of an induction last night when we were in her hangout, that because she's equating DNA replication to the coding of a computer, of course, based on all these people who are calling the DNA a code sequence, not understanding that that's just a phrase we use to describe something that it is. It doesn't mean anything. It's just a coding. So she made the analogy between the computer, like Carlton was saying, zeros and ones make this happen on the screen. Therefore, she induced that this DNA thing had to have an intelligent design. I said, well, no, it doesn't. You're making I think the word is equivocation. It's a false analogy.
Yeah.
But you know, I don't know.
That is a problem. The way I try and illustrate this one is the avalanche. An avalanche comes down one of the Alps and wipes out a village. Absolutely devastating. And the scientists decide, why was this avalanche so devastating? And if we're going to prevent it, we need to know what actually triggered it to go. And they'll build a model. And they'll have to take into account a whole bunch of parameters. They'll need to take into account the composition of the snowpack and the composition of the various layers of the snowpack. They'll need to take in the temperatures in the snowpack and in the various layers of the snowpack. They'll have to take into account recent weather, recent wind speed, recent temperatures, fresh snowfall, all sorts of things they will have to take into account. And then run their model, and with a bit of luck and a following wind, their model gives them the avalanche that they had. Exactly. Okay? Now, there's a heck of a lot of intelligence went into building that model. Does that mean the original avalanche had to have intelligence behind it?
No.
And that's the analogy that I use. When somebody comes up with this idea of, but you see, it took an intelligent scientist to put the things together in a test tube. Yeah, and it took intelligence to put together the avalanche model. But it still doesn't mean that the original avalanche was intelligently caused. And that is one of the major misunderstandings that I've come across.
Yeah.
I can put salt in a cup of cold water, and I can put salt in a cup of warm water, and see how quickly they dissolve, and do it time and time again, and the salt dissolves faster in the warm water. And I can then say, okay, increase the temperature and the salt will dissolve faster. But that doesn't mean intelligence was required to make the salt dissolve in the first place. It's not intelligent dissolving. Do you understand what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
They think that the scientist doing the experiment somehow is influencing it because of intelligence. They are not. You could take somebody as dumb as a bag of hammers and get them to put the two chemicals together and they'll do the same thing. It's got nothing to do with the operator at all. So when we're looking at abiogenesis and we're looking at the various experiments that have been done, we have to say, do not bring in the scientists as an intelligent cause, because the chemicals do not know. The chemicals don't care less who or what puts them together. If they're going to react, they'll react. If they're not going to react, they won't. Chemicals don't sulk because they don't like the person. Sorry, you can tell this is something that really annoys me.
It's like they could do like 1,000 experiments using different chemicals or enzymes or whatever to try to see what works. It's not like, okay, well, we know these, if we put these two together, they're going to do this certain thing. That's not what they're doing. They're looking at different variables and temperature or chemistry or whatever, and then, oh, hey, wow, look, this one works, you know.
Yeah. Now, that brings us into what have we found out so far. We found out that we can put together ribose and a pyrimidine base, and that the bond will form to turn that into a nucleoside. The base will attach to the sugar. So that will give you a ribonucleoside. And if you put a bunch of ribonucleosides together in the correct conditions, they will polymerize into a long chain, which makes it RNA. That's purely by chemical reactions. So we know that it is possible chemically for RNA to form naturally.
That was a Lincoln Joyce experiment?
No, that's not Lincoln and Joyce.
Oh, okay.
That was back in December last year.
Oh, okay.
And I couldn't get a hold of the paper.
Fiona, have you ever heard of the John Orrell's experiments?
Sorry?
Have you ever heard of the John Orrell's experiments?
I don't know. If you shove it, a link in the chat, and I'll have a look.
I'll see if I can look for that. But the main point I was trying to share was, it is possible, like recognizing how interacting molecules, like arising from the laws of chemistry, can produce life as studied in biology, given those biochemical interactions and billions of years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and the thing is, in showing that something can occur naturally, that is not anybody saying that is how it happened. What the point now is, well, we can't rule that one out.
I think part of the problem is that they have so many possible mechanisms. They're not entirely sure which one it is. It could have happened a dozen different ways, and then a dozen different ways on top of that. We just don't actually. When we say we don't know how it happened, what we mean is we don't know which one of the many mechanisms it actually happened with, and it could actually have happened with all of them. I mean, scientists. A famous quote mine is, I'm trying to think who the hell it is that they're talking to, but there's a quote mine where somebody's talking to somebody famous about them not believing in a single cell being the ancestor of everything, and that what they're actually talking about is that at an early stage, because of what they call it, where you get genes from one species into another one. It's like
horizontal.
Horizontal. Horizontal gene transfer.
I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Because of that, your early phylogenetic tree would have been more of a bramble patch with things crossing all over the place. So we could quite possibly have had a great many initial precursors that crossed over, and there may not be any one specific particular method, but lots of them, and what we've got is the sum total of what survived.
Oh yeah, by natural selection,
yeah. And we also have to bear in mind as well that the term living, the term life, is a human construct. There isn't a particular cutoff point within nature where something suddenly sparkles and it's alive. It's life, and chemistry is a graduating. It's a gradual scale. You have things like viruses that are not alive. They're not what we would class living. But it doesn't mean to say they're any less complex. Some viruses are incredibly complex indeed, and the mechanisms that they actually use to actually propagate are they're beautiful in most cases, even if the result is not. But the mechanisms that they actually use. So you got to think that that might not be alive, but the complexity in the thing, and then you realize that when you can explain most of the virus stuff away as simply inherent properties of chemicals, then you realize if you move that little marker, which we have all agreed is life, we can move it either way. We can move it to include the virus, or we can move it further up the scale and turn around and say, well, life is not unicellular, life is multicellular. It's up to us where we decide life is, if you know what I mean. There isn't this magical point where that's alive, that's not, and the thing that was a precursor to it is just a pile of chemicals, and the thing that resulted goes bing, and it sparkles and it's alive.
So I'm just taking my wee message here.
If that makes any sense, discuss.
No, I mean, it does make sense, and this is the difficulty, because when you try to define life, you do come to a sort of grey area. It's difficult because viruses are sort of on the cusp. They're not quite alive.
You got prions and things like that. There's a lot of things just on the cusp.
Yeah. Now, I mean, I think that your first step, I think, is going to have to be a self-replicator. And that's why, I mean, I'm quite focused in on RNA as the first self-replicator. I mean, I think it's fine. It's fine to have little mycelials, etc. But there has to be something to do with the reproduction in some way.
I mean, one thing that we know for sure is that primitive life would not have looked anything like the single cell of today. So when creationists turn around and say, look how complex this single cell is, they're looking at, look how complex this single cell 4 billion years after later has evolved to be. The initial life, you would have been saying, yeah, you would have had something like RNA, self-replicating. You will have possibly a lipid shell to protect it from the environment. Just very, very simple bits and pieces as things get added on. I mean, they believe that it's understood that things like mitochondria were not originally part of the actual cell. They were a perfect example of a symbiotic relationship early on in the history of this planet, where you had simple life that were very simple to mitochondria. Remember, you've got mitochondrial RNA. It's got its own, mitochondria has got its own RNA. And because it lived inside larger cells, that eventually it just became part of the cells. That it just ended up being there, you know.
Yeah.
But it originally started off as a separate organism, and as a separate organism before becoming an organelle. I believe there's other bits and pieces that they've since discovered that may also have had a similar origin. And if you look how simple those things are, and you realize that whatever it was that started off was much simpler than that.
Yeah.
Yeah, when the cells divide, the mitochondria, they divide too, I guess. So it's passed on. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm going.
No, you go.
I was going to say, I mean, if you think that life tends to go with the simplest solution first, rather than reinvent the wheel, if you have an organism that can actually metabolize and generate, basically generate chemical energy within the cell, itself, it makes sense that something like that would be absorbed into other cells, that other cells would, as it were, leech off it, borrow it, incorporate it within themselves, and until the point where actually cells have advanced to the point that they cannot exist, really, or they can exist, but they cannot compete with other cells. They cannot compete with other cells unless they contain the mitochondria.
Yeah. And the other thing to remember is there's a comment that I came across a couple of days back, and it was the usual, yeah, but naked RNA, they can't survive in the environment. Wrong. There are a bunch of plant pathogens, viroids, and they are just naked RNA.
Depends which environment you're talking about.
Exactly. Now, one of the difficulties is this. If you try and do these experiments currently, the world is full of an enzyme called RNase. Now, RNase is a nasty little enzyme, and it chomps RNA. And it chomps it very, very effectively. And these enzymes retain their activity even if you autoclave them at 121 degrees for 15 minutes at 15 pounds pressure. They denature in the heat, but they renature when they cool down. So they're a pain in the backside to get rid of. Now, they are produced by cells as a way of chomping up messages within a cell that are no longer needed. So you've got messenger RNA coming off the gene and heading off to the ribosomes for translation. And if these RNA molecules weren't degraded, it would mean that a gene, once it was switched on, even if it got switched off, the messenger would hang around and just keep getting used and used and used and used and used. So you wouldn't have any switch to be able to switch it off. So by having these enzymes that degrade RNA, you can ensure that if your gene gets switched off, the message runs out. Right? Makes sense. Now, you know that our planet is absolutely full of organisms with DNA, and therefore RNase, the enzyme. But in the distant past, before life arose, there was no RNase. So when you try to do the experiments with RNA now, you have got to be very, very careful, because it's hard to get an RNase-free environment. It's very hard to work with RNA. I've done it. That's what I mainly concentrated on. And I am telling you now that it's very hard to work with RNA. It's very hard to do the experiments with RNA because of all the RNAs around. Now, one of the arguments I've heard against the RNA world hypothesis was that RNA degrades so easily. I mean, you know, you just look at it and it degrades. So how could it hang around and be the first replicator? Well, because you wouldn't have any of the enzyme to degrade it back then.
Yeah, in a very primitive Earth, you're talking there being very, very little chemicals around, or at least not very complex chemicals to dissolve RNA.
Exactly, and these enzymes really are, well, let's put it this way. You could almost guarantee that if you were going to open a tube of RNA that you had prepped, that there would be an RNase molecule sitting on the end of your bench, sniggering, with his training shoes on, waiting to run and jump in that tube. There was always an RNase molecule with your name written on it if you were opening up one of your valuable samples. It's that bad. But, as I say, that enzyme is produced by living cells. So in the pre-life world, there weren't any living cells to produce it. So you don't have to worry about that one. There are, I think, a lot of the thinking about this, if you go by, you take your pure logic and you say, well, RNA can't survive very long in the environment, and we know it can't. But if you ignore the fact that way back then the same problems weren't around, then it is almost like counterintuitive to say, but back then it could survive. And it's only when you take all the factors into account that suddenly it's logical that it would survive. So it can't survive now, but it could have survived then. Does that make sense?
Well, it's obvious it did survive.
Exactly. So I find when people make that argument, that in a way it's an argument from ignorance, because they don't actually know where RNase, the enzyme, comes from in the first place.
And I mean, if it didn't build up a system to survive, our cells, if we look at our cells and how they're structured and all that kind of stuff, if they couldn't have formed the ability to survive, our cells would degrade, even though they technically do. But essentially, you would end up with a falling apart system. If it couldn't be structured in a way for it to survive, it would be surviving in its current state.
Yeah, and that's one of the things with evolution, that what we see is what survived to be sampled.
Absolutely.
Survived to be observed. Because if it didn't work, it didn't survive. And I think that's one of the things that's forgotten, that we are only looking at the successes. We're not able to look at the failures on the biochemical level, because they haven't survived to be sampled or observed or studied.
Well, I've been looking into abiogenesis, at least abiogenesis research into, you know, how the arguments go. Oh, you can't get all those proteins, those necessary things in order to form RNA, and it's like in the prebiotic Earth, in primitive Earth conditions, is what I meant to say. And I've been doing a lot of research into it, and based on a lot of the theses I've been reading, it's perfectly plausible to get a lot of the chemicals. We've gotten sugars, we've gotten fats, we've gotten a bunch of different other necessary chemicals needed for RNA. They got nucleids. That's right. I think.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is that one of the reasons that you don't have to, with the RNA world hypothesis, one of the reasons that you don't have to worry about proteins is because RNA can act as a catalyst.
Yeah, for proteins.
Sorry?
It can act as a catalyst to make different structures.
Yeah, and so you don't actually need the enzymes as the protein-based catalysts, because that's what an enzyme is, protein catalyst. But you don't need those proteins if you've got RNA around, because RNA can catalyze reactions. And those molecules are called ribozymes, not to be confused with ribosomes, which are the little structures that are involved in protein synthesis. But ribozymes, that's the Lincoln and Joyce paper, where two RNA molecules together catalyzed the replication of each other.
Yeah.
No protein involved. DNA cannot do that. DNA can't catalyze reactions. That's one of the reasons why I think that RNA came first.
Yeah. I mean, if you look up on scholarly.google.com RNA formation under primitive Earth conditions, you can actually see a lot of the stuff we've been able to synthesize under those primitive Earth conditions.
Yeah.
Let's see, there was something particular interesting. RNA, turns out, if you take it from a oxygen-enriched environment, and we're talking about O2, and you put it in an oxygen-deprived environment, it actually reacts very interestingly with iron. Have you seen that report?
No, I haven't seen that one.
Okay, let me bring it up. But they did there's experiments, and they're probably going to replicate them in order to verify them. first, but let me get to it for you.
Is Paul having a problem there?
I think he's hysterical about something, but I don't know what it is.
No, he had to use both hands.
Yeah. The thing is, I don't know if any of you have actually heard him on the video, where he just couldn't stop laughing. Right, I'm having a look to see what this is.
Oh, Fiona.
Yes.
Oh,
just gold.
Okay.
I'm watching it now.
So, does anyone know the real identity of Satan Atheist yet?
Okay. Paul, just go ahead and mute yourself and just holler. That might work better before you bust.
I'm watching this. Oh.
That should be on screen share.
I could do it. Hold on.
I'm trying
I can
to post
actually screen
I'm trying
share.
to post it, but I have to sign in.
Yeah, no, hold on. I can actually screen share and play the audio. Hold on, give me a second. Because I run it through my phone, the audio, but I could screen share it. I need Fiona to click on my screen when I do that. Oh,
I'm going to drop the link.
I've just watched it myself and I couldn't stop laughing, so I can understand why Paul just broke down quite literally.
That was fucking brilliant.
I'm still watching it, but I've just paused it to.
Oh, it gets better. It just gets better.
Oh.
hold on, let me get it ready so that way the audience can enjoy this amazing thing that we have found.
I've put the link into YouTube comments.
Satan Atheist is not available for this platform yet.
Oh.
You could use the Google app, can't you? The YouTube app.
Fiona, you want to add the Q&A link or whatever in the chat in the thing too?
Sorry?
You want to add the Q&A link or the Hangout link in the YouTube feed?
The link. I thought I put it in there.
How to get the link is on the side, on the right side. It should have dots.
Lower right.
Yeah, lower right.
It'll give you a choice of the actual Hangout and the Q&A.
What Q&A didn't start off? I went and forgot it again.
He is gonna shit kittens when
Yeah.
he that.
I mean, I was.
Now, wasn't that just clever?
Yeah, it's Paul's fault this time. Can't blame Carlton.
I have to wonder what I walked
Well, Paul looked like he was about to pass out, and we finally asked him what was wrong.
Oh, so
and
I'm
he
back.
posted that link.
Oh, I put the link into the YouTube comments so that everybody could see why we were all absolutely howling. Oh, it's broken me. It's completely broken me. Oh, Paul. Yo, good grief, man. Oh, boy. That is brilliant, isn't it?
He's going to be so mad. That's terrible, is that? That's disgusting, is that? Take that down. I'm being persecuted.
It was a beautiful production.
I'm being persecuted. You must have sympathy for me.
Absolutely brilliant. Absolutely. Oh, so funny.
Okay, last week was on RNA duplication and stuff.
Yeah, but Paul seemed to be having a heart attack there. I was getting really worried about him.
I just had to ask what was going on with Paul because he had both hands over his mouth and looked like he was just turning red.
Yeah.
Well, now you've seen why, eh?
Yes.
Yes, and very, very impressed. Absolutely fantastic. That person is so talented. I'm going to end up learning all those words.
Piece of a cat.
Because the other one I get an earworm from is, I'm not going to say the words, but the wee tune is. You know the one I mean?
You know, I always find these really funny and amazing, but I always feel left out because I haven't been made into one of these characters yet. And what the odd thing is I was the most involved with G-Man. I had to deal with him the most. So yeah. I deserve to be made into a character more than anyone.
Gotta give it time.
We don't know what you look like.
Oh, I come on camera every so often, and
So anyway,
you was talking about the RNA molecules and different stuff, and certain chemicals or enzymes would stop them that exist now that didn't exist. That got me looking up how did the original, how they think the cell membranes started, because that would protect the inner workings of the cell from the outside, except for whatever it allows in or out.
Yeah, and the thing is, though, I mean, at some point there would need to be the transition made from RNA to DNA. But one of the things is that RNA is replication-wise is more unstable with DNA. You get more mistakes in RNA than you do in DNA. But the only difference is an oxygen atom.
There's TV on somewhere?
I think there was. But yeah, so the only difference is an oxygen atom, but it changes the stability. DNA replicates more stably than RNA does. So at some point there's been that transition, but some of them didn't transition because we still have the RNA viruses around. And we still have the viroids, which are the naked RNA plant pathogens. So,
well, they had to be forming early on once the DNA came out, in early symbiotic life with the DNA living cells and the viruses. So they would, keep attacking each other, so forth.
Yeah, but I mean, you then got to say, but viruses could have become obligate parasites. Doesn't mean they always have been. If that makes sense. Just because now they can't reproduce without a host cell doesn't mean that it has always been that way. There would be a selection pressure to get rid of any superfluous functions. And we can't know. See, this is the problem. We can't actually know how it was. As Paul said, the problem we have is that there are so many possibilities. Now we can rule out certain ideas if it turns out that they are chemically impossible. But when we find ones that are chemically possible, that's about as far as we can go at that point. Yes, this is possible. This can happen naturally. But we can't say that is how it happened. We can just say it's a possibility. So we can end up with a number of possibilities. But will we ever actually get down to the actual answer? what was the very first self-replicator?
I don't think we'll ever really know.
No, I don't think we will either. But what I will say is that I don't see that saying that something can occur naturally in any way is removing God from the picture. It doesn't. It means that it can happen naturally. You don't have to posit divine intervention. There is no problem with that. I can roll a tennis ball down a hill. I don't have to invoke God to make it roll down the hill. But that doesn't take God out of the equation completely. And science isn't really in the business of having anything to say about God. What science can do is say, well, look, from what we can tell by examining the creation itself, the rocks, etc., or the life, is that the account given in Genesis cannot be literally true, word for word. That's exactly how it happened. There's too much evidence against it. However, that says nothing about God. It's only saying something about the Genesis account. And there's a big difference there. And I think this is one of the reasons why people have railed against evolution, because they see it as removing God when it isn't. It's taking issue with the method by which life arose.
Yeah, I forget the scientist who said all evolution did was essentially make it possible for the process to be understood without God.
Yeah.
You know, you didn't need a God for it to happen. So I think people take that personally to mean that, you know, God doesn't exist, but it doesn't actually say that God doesn't exist. It doesn't make any claim on it whatsoever.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the points that tends to get lost, because I've lost count of the number of times that the terms, and I hate this term, evolutionist, is conflated with atheist.
Yeah, I think that they've heard, well, many fundamentalists have heard many times that it's the same, but even the ones who have heard it is not the same still label it as the same for that very reason, for the reason that you don't need God, and therefore in their minds, if you don't need God, then that means to them God doesn't exist. But that's a very simplistic way of you know, it's not. But you know, when you know, I'm sure you've watched episodes of the Atheist Experience. Many of the fundamentalist callers who call in really lack a skill of nuanced debate and argumentation, which is painfully clear when you listen to them talk about what they think evolution means and what they think atheism means and what they think science means, and they really they can. It's almost as if they cannot make a single point without throwing a huge ton of logical fallacies in that point that they're trying to get across, and that is assuming even that they're making a point which is understandable half the time. Yeah. So I think it's more a case that I don't want to say they're stupid, but they weren't educated in that skill in any way whatsoever, and it's painfully clear, and that's why Matt is so skilled at taking them apart so quickly because it's just too easy. I mean, you know, it's like in the Seinfeld episode with Kramer in the kung fu class, and he's going up against 6-year-olds, and and they're going up against him, and he just basically pushes them away, and he's declared a winner because they haven't developed the skill set to make a debating point logically. Although to be fair, I don't think you can make a defense of God in a completely logical way. You will, in the end, have to rely on some sort of faith. But at least to make a clear argument is what's being asked for, and most of them cannot do it.
Yeah. I mean, in my arguings online, I've lost count of the number of times that the assumption is just made, I'm an atheist because I will argue in favour of evolution. In fact, Saiten Buggenkate made exactly that mistake. When the subject was science, it was not religion. But the assumption was made that I was an atheist. And as soon as I pointed out that I wasn't, he blocked me.
Okay.
He's recently unblocked me again. But that's the thing that baffles me in a way, because I don't see why I have to believe in a literal 6-day creation as described in whatever version of Genesis. Why I have to believe that to be a Christian?
You don't have to, Fiona.
Yeah, that's the thing.
Yeah.
The most important thing any believer has is your relationship between yourself and Christ, and Christ and you and God. That is the most important thing.
Yeah.
It's a very everything we read in the book of Genesis, and to be honest, 95% of the Bible is faith. I myself rely on faith when it talks about the events in the Old Testament and the New Testament as well. But there are some things which we can be certain of. And to me, one of the certainties I have is the biggest one, and that is that God is real. It's as simple as that. Now, is he the God of the Bible? I can't honestly say for sure whether he is or not. I know he's the God of all flesh. But if someone to say to me, is God the God of the Bible? Well, I'm probably going to say, well, I've kind of got a bias towards the Bible because I've been brought up, I live in England. But I cannot nail it down exactly that God is the God of the Bible, because he's the God of everyone. The Bible is a way we express God through man's writings, and someone in another part of the world would express it in a different way, like the Quran or something else or something else. We all believe in God, but we have our own ideas of what God is, and that's where the books obviously come from. But yes, there is one God. It's the God who created energy and matter to create the universe. He created the laws which govern the universe. And if he created those laws, then he can sure as hell bend the bloody things if he created them. If he can't break the laws, to create man on the 6th day, another thing as well, then by definition, he ain't God. Because if he cannot break the laws he set out, by definition, he cannot be God. There's something.
I look at it slightly differently. In that, I mean, I look at it that God put the basic laws of physics in place.
Right.
And then he stood back, because with those laws of physics in place, he knew where it would end up.
Absolutely.
Remember, physics governs chemistry. Chemistry governs biochemistry. Biochemistry governs biology.
I haven't got a problem with that myself. See, this is what a lot of atheists miss. If they just read the God of the Bible, the attributes which this God has got, then it's so plainly obvious that miracles can happen. We, in the sense which we live our world, our lives in the empirical world, we know that we ourselves cannot, because we are human beings, we cannot turn water into wine. We can't walk on water. these things are obviously evidential, and demonstrable. You ever try to walk on water and water into wine, it ain't going to happen. But when you put God in the fray, when God is there, who can obviously do these things, miracles can happen. It's the reason why Jesus Christ walked on water. Yes, Peter walked on water as well, but Christ was with him.
Yeah. And the thing about that is that is on faith. We take those miracles
absolutely by faith. I mean, as I say, 95% of things which are mentioned in the book, in the Bible itself, we have to take those things by faith and faith alone. We cannot prove these things. We cannot prove the 6 days of creation. That is a faith issue. But when God is God, and with God all things are possible, then why should we really doubt?
The problem I have with that is that if I go to the young earth creationism and the 6 days of creation, I would have to ask myself, well then, why did God
take 6 days?
No. Why would he put the evidence there to fool us that the earth was actually older? You see, that to me would suggest a trickster God.
I mean, in the Bible, it doesn't give us a date when creation was actually made. We don't know when it was. It's just kind of through the lineages. Some begat someone else, some begat someone else. He lives for so long. He lives for so long. Blah blah blah. I think you said earlier it was some Belgian priest or something, wasn't it?
No, Bishop Usher. He's the Bishop of Armagh.
It was him who kind of come up with the idea that it's probably around about 6,000 years, no more than 10,000 years. It's to me it's so plainly obvious that the world is probably not older than that. Although I can't say for sure because that's not my area of expertise.
Yeah. Well, we actually had somebody at the beginning who explained.
Yeah, I caught the back end of that. I had to go do some work. So
if you take the model and you plug in the young ages,
right,
you get the predictions based on just basic laws of physics. You get predictions of what you will find in your borehole when you're looking for oil, to do with temperatures, structure, all the rest of it.
Okay.
And when you drill your borehole, that's not what you find. Whereas when you put in those old ages in the model, you get out predictions of what you will find in your borehole.
Right.
And when you drill your borehole, that's exactly what you find.
So what's he saying? Is he saying that the Earth is definitely? I think he did. He said it was like so many millions of years old, didn't he?
4.567 billion.
Okay, well,
4.5.
But now they say it's probably a few million years older.
Okay.
Which kind of pissed me off because it was such an easy number to remember, and now it's not.
4.53 something or other billion years old. That's the minimum.
But at the end of the day, nobody really can nail it down to an exact time. So on our side, with me being a Christian, me being a theist, not necessarily a young Earth creationist, but with me being a believer, I believe that it was God who created the universe, the Earth. I don't know how old it is, so it takes faith for me to believe that, and also on the side of the paleontologists or the geologists or whatever they have to also go by a certain amount of faith as well.
No, because they have the evidence.
It's the evidence and the math. It's like 1 and 1 equals 2.
Yeah, we have dating methods.
Yes, but
we have dating methods.
Okay, but the problem is, you see, they have faith that they've got it right.
No, because it's demonstrable.
But the problem is, so why did they not get it right first time? This is what I'm saying. I'm saying that they think, well, we've got faith that this is true.
No, because in science you have a plus or minus error range for the experiment you're doing. When you're doing an experiment on something that old,
error range, so they have faith that they're actually.
No, because that's given because of the evidence from other experiments and the methods you happen to use and the calculations that come out of it. That's demonstrable as well. You can't just you can't take anything on faith in science. I mean, you won't get your paper published. It's not that they make it up. I mean,
but it just seems like the first prediction was this, and I think we've got that wrong. No, so it's this. Okay, we got that one wrong, but now it's this. Now it's this. This is this. You think, well, hang on a minute. How many times you kind of?
No, it's a process of refinement. If you refine your answer more and more, given more and more data. But the thing that we do know is it's not getting younger; it's getting older. The more we refine our methodology, so there's a reason for that.
Do you have faith that the next time they come up with, the next date they come up with, is going to be the correct one?
It's not a matter of faith. It's a matter.
Whoa.
I think we're getting off track.
Whoa. Can I please just say something here?
Sure. Yes.
What I just said was that the age of 4.53 was the minimum age. Yeah. Minimum.
Yeah.
Now, what that means is you go away and you date your rocks, right? You've got some rock samples. You date those rock samples. What if every sample you have there is coming in at 1 billion or less? Then because you've got one at 1 billion, you can say, well, it must be at least 1 billion. And then somebody comes in with another rock sample, and it's older by 1 billion. So you say, now we've reached, well, minimum of 2 billion. Now, if somebody then comes in with a rock sample that is 1 million years old, that still doesn't change the minimum of 2 billion.
Yeah.
Do you see what I mean?
It's kind of like the reason we've come to this.
The reason we've come to the figure we've got is because that is the oldest rock that we've dated. Now, there may be older rocks out there that we haven't found yet. But finding a younger rock isn't going to change what date the older rock gave.
Fiona, what is the oldest type of rock you can get? Because I know rocks are kind of being made, from igneous rocks and volcanoes and things like that. Would it actually mean that if you actually got hold of an igneous rock and you cracked it open and you looked at the age of the rock, how there's different ways of doing that, I suppose, would that say that it's, say for instance, like 2 years ago there was a volcano which exploded some part of the world, and then you get to part of the rock which came out of that volcano, which was probably new created because it cooled down, lava cooled down. I mean, could you tell from the structure that it was a newly made rock, or would it still be made of material which has been around for billions of years? How would that?
Since it became lava and molten, you couldn't tell that. The only thing you can tell is the last time it was molten and it cooled. There's a change there. See, I think before we get too sidetracked, though, the point, Andy, is not that even though there are atheists in here, we're not debunking God as creator. We're not doing that. We're just trying to look at where the young Earth creationists are trying to use science that we know works and trying to cram it into 6,000 years. That's all. We're not discounting God. We're just looking at the science. That's all.
I don't think you can do that, because I think the dating methods are pretty much, all the dating methods prove without a shadow of a doubt that it's older than 10,000 years.
Yeah, but I was going to answer your question about the age of the rocks. There actually was just a video published, I think, on Science Show on YouTube or something. I can get the URL for you if you want soon. Very interesting presentation where the presenter, she goes to one of the labs where they have literally the oldest rocks available, and what they found in them are actually older than the Earth. They're diamonds. They're diamonds that were formed in the star. It's diamond dust. You can't actually. It's not like well-formed diamonds. They've dissolved the rock, and you see a sort of bluish white, a liquid that they've dissolved it in. They're diamonds that formed in another star, which blew up. They weren't formed on the Earth. They're part of the solar ejecta from the supernova, which ended up being part of our system. And these are actually the oldest objects ever found on Earth, and they come from another star, not our own.
Yeah, but we're talking about the age of the Earth here. And, I mean, the way they do it is basically as follows. Argon is a gas. It's a rare gas. And gases will bubble out of a liquid. Okay? Now, under pressure, in the way under the crust, you have argon in what is going to be lava. And it's under great pressure, and that's what's keeping it in there. Now, when a volcano goes and the pressure is released, it's like shaking a bottle of pop and then unscrewing the lid. And that gas will come out of the liquid because the pressure is released. But it can only bubble through molten rock. Okay? Now, that argon bubbles out of the rock. So now, as the rock solidifies on the surface of the Earth, it solidifies with no argon in it because it's all bubbled out. But one of the things that you'll find is that under the crust there is an isotope called potassium-40, and it's radioactive, and it decays to argon-40. So the potassium becomes argon, okay?
Right.
Now, within the solidified rock, the potassium is busy decaying down to argon. But because it's a solid rock, it now can't get out. It's stuck in that rock. And as time goes on, the amount of argon in the rock is going to increase because it's being added to by the decay of the potassium.
Right. Okay.
Right? So what they do to then date the rock is they look at the amount of argon-40 that is in that rock.
Yeah.
And they know the rate at which potassium-40 decays. And it's on the half-life is...
2,750 years?
No, it's in the billions.
Yeah.
It's in the billions. That's
Right.
how long it would take for half of the potassium to decay to argon.
Right.
So they can, by measuring the amount of argon...
How can they measure it though? That's the thing, you know. How can they see it decay if it takes billions of years?
What they do is they measure the amount of argon that's present in the solid rock. Because remember, it's trapped in there.
Mm.
It can't bubble out of the solid rock. It bubbled out of the molten rock.
Right.
But once that rock solidified, when it cooled down, the gas can't bubble through that now.
I'm just thinking, how would they know it takes billions of years for it to, you know...
It's atomic theory.
Yeah, it's basic atomic theory and the basic laws of physics. Now, Matthew Hunt has done a couple of papers which he put online explaining the mathematics behind the determination of half-lives. And you should hunt them down. If you get in touch with Matthew Hunt and ask him for the links to that.
Right.
Because they're very, very good. I honestly don't know where the links are just now. But using a mass spectrometer, they can detect the argon and they can measure the amount of argon that's there. And they're saying that if the rock at time 0 has no argon in it because it's all bubbled out.
Right, it's billions of years.
Yeah. Now, that method's been superseded by the argon dating method. And it's a measure of the ratios of 2 different argon isotopes. But I'm just going with the potassium one because it's such an easy one to explain.
Right, okay.
Somebody else could go with the argon method, but we don't have Kevin Donahoe in here. But by using another method, by going on to a more sensitive method, of argon dating. What they're doing is they're refining the measure that they get. And the reason you always get a plus or minus, your error bars, is because the science isn't arrogant enough to say it is this number and no other. They will say, there is a margin of error. Imagine if you were measuring a distance with a ruler and your smallest divisions on it are millimeters. Okay? And what you measure comes to an end between 2 of the millimeter marks.
Right, okay.
So you could say the length of it was between, say, 8.4 and 8.5 centimeters. So it's in that range. Because, okay, so that's your range. Because you don't have a smaller division on your ruler. And it's, with any instrumentation in science, you have got various thresholds. And you always have to take into account those thresholds. And you've also got to take into account things like, with your dating methods, atmospheric contamination. Now, there is argon in the atmosphere.
Yes.
So a very sensitive instrument and a very young rock that doesn't have a lot of argon in it, that atmospheric contamination would make a huge difference. Could make a 50% difference in the age. Whereas if your rock is billions of years old, that amount of atmospheric contamination would only be a tiny, tiny fraction of a percent of an error. And that's one of the reasons why the argon dating methods can only be used on rocks older than a certain method.
That's right, yeah.
Because the error bars,
it's like carbon dating.
Younger rocks would be bigger than the you'd be talking about you getting an age of 200,000 years plus or minus 400,000 years.
Right. Okay.
Which is giving you the most ridiculous range. And that's also the problem with what Steve Austin did. Steve Austin took dacite from Mount St. Helens that was either 10 or 20 years old. And he put it through this dating method and he got nonsense out of it. And that was because the method is absolutely no use when the amount of argon is going to be so small.
Yeah, it's like trying to measure the width of a needle with a yardstick. You're not going to get any comprehensive result unless something is bigger than a yard. And the bigger it is, then the more accurate that yardstick becomes in measuring it.
Yeah.
To get to the first measurement, you have to have something at least a yard long.
Yeah. Now, if you imagine that I use my ruler again to measure something, and it's coming in between 0 and 0.1 of a centimetre, right?
Okay. Yep.
Your range is 0 to 0.1. And you look at the percentage that is covering compared to your 8.5 centimetres. So the percentage is different overall.
Right.
You're only going to be half a millimetre out, and that is going to be, it could be up to 100% on the tiny measure, but it's going to be 1/85th on the 8.5 centimetre piece. So your percentage error is much smaller. And as the refined techniques, it's like the speed of light measurements. When you look at them, and over the years you think, well, they keep changing. It's because the measuring techniques have become better. They've become more sensitive. So you're adding divisions to your ruler.
Yeah, and it's never that they are deviating wildly from one end to the next. They are going slowly in a certain direction refined in a certain direction. They have not, suddenly come out with new evidence that the world is only 20 million years old or something.
Yeah.
It's because, science doesn't change its mind, science refines the findings. So when people say, well, they just don't know because they're constantly changing the number. Yeah, it's a refinement process. You can be pretty darn sure it's in that ballpark. Plus, they have the added problem of when actually rocks formed on the Earth. It wasn't an instantaneous moment. It took millions and millions of years. So at what point do you say, well, that's a rock formed at the formation of the Earth, or that's a rock from outer space that collided? It's really, there are problems of origins that far back in time where you really are not sure whether the lava had coalesced, over 20 million years or over 30 million. It's hard to tell. So you do have those problems. But they're never going to be outside of that general range. You're not going to find suddenly, you're not going to wake up the next morning and scientists are going to have discovered that the Earth is, 20 billion years old or 20 million years old. It's not going to be that much of a change. It's going to be within that ballpark.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at humans and lifespan, and you say, well, it's 70 to 80 years, finding a 3-year-old isn't going to change what you estimate the lifespan to be.
Right, exactly.
And that's why finding younger rocks doesn't invalidate this minimum age.
It's like in archaeology. In fact, when you're digging a site and you find somebody had done renovations on it, 200, 300 years later, it doesn't invalidate that the original castle was built in the Middle Ages or something. It's going to need an explanation why that's there, but it doesn't actually say, well, the whole thing is from 1700 instead of from 1100. It's not a Norman castle. We thought it was a Norman castle, but that's not actually how it works. So it's a bit like that,
So I mean that explains why we can be pretty sure that the Earth is about 4.53 billion years old at a minimum. It is based on empirical data, it's based on observations, it's based on measurements, and there isn't faith involved in that.
Yeah, and the one thing about lava, when the way you check the age of lava, you're going to come out for a wide range of ages because the results of the test is only showing when it cooled off from being lava.
Right,
yeah,
exactly.
So you'll have different ages for lava.
Yeah, because probably, if it remelts,
yeah, that'll change the age.
All the argon would escape and it would reset the clock to 0.
Right.
So the oldest rocks that we have take us to about 4.5 billion.
Right. Guys, I gotta go. I'm gonna quit now because football's on TV. I want to go. I'm a bit.
How did the Algeria game end?
Say again, sorry, Fiona.
Algeria, South Korea. How did it end?
They got beat 5-2.
Oh.
By Algeria.
Yeah, because it was 3-1 when I stopped watching,
yeah,
and I thought South Korea were going to do it.
The Americans are playing now. I think they 1-0 down to Portugal at the moment. So.
I would love it if America won. I know it would take a bloody miracle, but
I want at least one speaking nation to be somewhere doing sort of pretty good,
Well, it's very difficult in my house because my husband is English. You can tell I'm not. And
really, I thought you were from Wiltshire.
Wiltshire? I'm from Wiltshire. Yeah.
I mean, we are very loyal to our team, but given that they're not in the World Cup again, we tend to be supporting anybody who's playing England.
Cheers, mate. What do you think of Scottish devolution then? What's your slant on that?
Do you know, I haven't decided. It depends if I go with my heart or my head.
Well, what is your heart saying? Go, you know.
My heart is saying, they may take our land, but they will never take our freedom.
Oh, that could be a bad mistake, mate. That could be a bad mistake.
I know, that's the thing. I mean, my head is saying, I can see all sorts of difficulties if we go down this route. Yeah. But I can also see all sorts of difficulties that we've been putting up with.
Life is okay for you guys. You're doing all right. You ain't broken to the politics.
Well, actually, you would be surprised at some of the effects that a lot of the legislation coming out of Westminster have had north of the border.
I would say, though, it's going to be very close, but I think that they won't do it. No. That they won't vote for independence overall. I could be wrong, and I think it's going to be too close to call anyway.
I really don't know.
I'm going to go. I'm okay. Next time you have a hangout, Fiona, just send us a link over.
Right. Okay. Well, I mean, I do Sunday nights at 9 o'clock or thereabouts.
You speak much with Alex Botton and some of the other crazy.
Sorry.
You speak much with Alex Botton and Matt Bell and a few of the other.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
I wouldn't mind having a chat with Alex Botton sometimes, but he doesn't seem to want to invite me or talk to me on YouTube anymore.
He just posted a video yesterday or today saying he's pretty much done with Hangouts for now.
He posts his video. It's almost like not as bad as JB. But...
Yeah, no, he just posted a video saying he's pretty much burnt out on Hangouts for now.
Yeah, we all have to take a break at some point.
Yeah.
Because it does become wearing, and given what's been going on over the last few months, that's why I've started doing these hangouts are just purely science, really, to get away from a lot of this. You're not a real Christian. No, you're not a real Christian. You've got it wrong. No, you've got it wrong.
No, there you go. As long as you have, you know. See, with me, I've had several very, very strange things in my life which science cannot. Well, it tries to explain. Obviously, the radicalised atheists will say that I'm a complete and utter lunatic, and I should go into an asylum somewhere, and there's medication for what I believe.
No, I believe you. France winning the World Cup a few years ago, that was that was a miracle enough for me.
It was in Paris, so they should have won it.
Yeah.
But the things which have happened in my life, which I can't explain, but they mean so much to me on a very, very personal level. I cannot deny what's happened to me, and I believe those things can be attributed to God.
Yeah.
When I needed most, and that's the reason why I have a cast iron certainty that God exists. I can't prove God, we can't see God, but He's in the hidden place. He's in here. He's where it matters. He comes to a person in a personal way. It's very, very unscientific because it's not demonstrable and you can't test it.
As soon as you say, it's
personal.
You can't prove it, you can't demonstrate it. It is faith. Then that I think is an honest position to take. When people start pulling out the evidence, what they call evidence, and they go into the realms of science, and they produce all this pseudoscientific nonsense as evidence.
It's to me, it's downright rude in a way as well, and they try to question your faith.
Yeah.
And if people want to live their life totally by empirical, evidential, demonstrable, then fine, let them do that.
Yeah,
at the end of the day, they will never understand God. Even if God comes to them, they'll simply say, brush it off and think, well, that can be explained by science. Well, in some cases, no, it can't be explained.
Yeah. The thing is, though, I mean, I think given the evidence, they would be prepared to accept it. It's just that we don't have that objective evidence. We have to say that it is faith.
But that's the thing, you see, because it's been designed that way, because God does not want everyone, hang on a minute, in this age, to be conformed into the image of His Son, Jesus Christ. That's Romans 8:29.
I think we lapsed into preaching and got away from the subject.
Yeah.
We'll say that for another night.
Yeah, that would be a good hangout, though.
That is more my. I'm not so much into science, although I can kind of battle away a little bit, from what I do know about certain things. But I'm more into kind of like the faith issue and sort of and that
well,
kind of
just bear in mind that what science does is it's looking at the created, what was created.
Right, it's looking at the evidence, isn't it?
And the thing is, when you look at the Bible, that's been filtered through man, and we all know man is fallible.
It's been all. Is it the infallible word of God? I mean, I don't know. That itself takes faith.
But the created itself is God's handiwork.
Yeah.
And he, in his created, there is the method that was used, and it's written in the language of science. If you learn how to read that language, then that's when I think you're reading God's word, not filtered through.
Yeah. Okay.
Because I honestly think that it is written in the created.
Yeah. Right.
It's in there, and we just have to learn to how to read it.
Sure.
And I mean, we've got a brain for a reason.
Sure, we have.
We're not supposed to check it at the church door.
He wants to go watch football. Let him go watch
football. Andy.
I've got to clean my shirt. I've got to clean my shirt, and I've got to. I've got to get myself ready for clothes ready for tomorrow for work. So I'm gonna have to go, guys.
Take it.
All right. Bye
Take
for now.
care, Andy.
Bye.
Bye.
Actually, that's an interesting thought when it comes to creation. Do you take the word?
It's a baby.
I like Nate's baby a lot.
Really cute, isn't it? But you take the words that were written down by a tribe. Or,
my tribe, no less. My tribe, here in this country.
Or look at the actual created and see what that tells you.
Yeah, I have a much more historical outlook on it than just a scientific outlook. Although I guess it's the science of history, but
I'm not saying just art history, because I think history is important. But when you are looking at how did this happen, how did it come about, what processes were involved, and then I think that's when you put the history to the side and you've got to look at the science.
Yeah. No, I agree. But the archaeology is based on science, and the history is in a sense based on science. You go by the documentation, you go by the archaeology, even the geology of the place, etc.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of elements to the history itself.
But the problem is that in attempting to maintain the young Earth creationism view, much of that is being ignored.
Well, you just can't really. You just can't. It doesn't add up. I mean, I know that they're dying for it to add up, but it just doesn't add up. There's no way you can really slice and dice it and make it work without just inventing stuff out of whole cloth. The pyramids are one example of how many people how many years after the flood would the pyramids have been built, and how many people would have taken, and could you get even close to that many people in a few generations? There's absolutely no way. There's no. It would require a miracle. So if you're going to start basing your science on miracles, it's not science, and that's just the end of the story right there.
Because you can't test that at all.
No, and not only that, the Egyptians themselves didn't give any indication that it took. It was a miracle that created
Yeah.
You know, we have records about how they built the pyramids, etc. So it would be really, you know, stretching the limits of credulity to.
Actually, I mean, Paul made a point earlier on, which I just thought was a fantastic point, in that within 100 years of the date of the flood, we had everything from domestic cats up to tigers.
Yeah.
And I would actually be interested in maybe digging around and having a look to see what we have going back to the putative creation date. I think that might be an interesting one.
Yeah.
But you know, I'm beginning to realise that the biggest problem for all of this comes down to the flood.
Yeah. Basically.
Because it doesn't matter how kind or whatever we're all created. The fact is that the slate is wiped almost clean at the flood.
Oh, yeah. Game changer, big time.
Yeah. And, I mean, the more you look at it, the more you realise that no matter what conclusions you come to about the creation itself and how it was done, the flood, and you try and apply the science to it, the flood changes everything.
You're back to having everybody on the planet descended from 8 people.
Yeah.
No matter which way you slice it.
Yeah.
Everything that comes before the flood, you can kind of, you know, it was rebooted, was the franchise.
Yeah. That's
a good way to put it.
Basically, yeah, yeah.
And of course, so we come back to our difficulty with kinds. Every time we end up, we circle back to the flood.
Yeah.
Of course, there was one thing though that wouldn't get rebooted. It was the original, you know, like we went back to like when cells started forming and RNA and DNA. So that wouldn't have changed though. That would still be something to look at.
Yeah.
How that process got going and everything.
Yeah. I just can't take the flood seriously.
Fiona, you familiar with Hox genes?
Yeah.
Okay, that was something I'd asked this question about. In from primitive animals on up, there are certain areas of the body that is like can be segmented up into, and it kind of matches from like insects to amphibians to birds to man. And I finally found that, and it was like different parts of the body and how I think the proteins or whatever that are made by produced by DNA can cause this segmenting or it gets the body form and order from the nose to the tail and the top to the bottom. Yeah, and I finally found that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean the Hox genes are the sort of the overall controllers.
Because I was wondering what mechanism controlled. I mean, it's like you could say quote unquote instructions in the DNA, but it's mostly what they're producing of proteins that do these other functions, if I understand right. And how it kind of all works and gets itself in order, and that was it. It's
to do with temporal expression of genes, and the Hox genes are global controllers of this temporal expression. So by switching on a Hox gene, that then controls the expression of a whole bunch of other genes.
And the thing is, though, they found the same types of Hox genes in insects, amphibians, fish, birds, mammals, humans. You know, I guess it's kind of like a general overall controlling mechanism in everything.
Yeah. And it
as far as what goes where or something. Instead of wings, and you have arms or fins.
Yeah.
But they're all in about the same place. Because
I mean, all the body plans are pretty much the same. Head at the front, bum at the back. And I mean, to me, that speaks of common descent, not common design. Now, actually, that could be next week's one.
Yeah, I got a quote for you. Since since we were ranting on creationists for a while, and deservingly so. I do have a quote for you from Sheikh Abdulaziz Ibn Baz, the supreme religious authority of Saudi Arabia in 1993, quote, "The earth is flat. Whoever claims it is round is an atheist deserving of punishment." So, you know, I think there are some places where it's even worse than
yeah. And that is pretty bad. But that is the one of the things that Answers in Genesis does. In that they say that all evidence has to line up with Scripture, and if it doesn't, you must ignore it.
Yeah, absolutely.
For you are a heretic and deserving of death, and I shall beat you with my rod of righteousness, and God in loving and peacefulness, this rod shall beat you to death.
Well, I'll go sit in my iron chariot, and you can go fuck off.
Well, you know, if you want to go, you know, beating with iron rods, just take a sword, and you can cut the iron rod if you have a sufficient sword.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, Fiona,
Uh-huh.
do you usually post the links to your Hangouts? Because I didn't see it.
Yeah, I did. I posted it in Google Plus.
Okay, I didn't see it.
I can't remember if I posted it underneath the YouTube video feed. The problem was that I fell asleep tonight, and so I was very late getting started.
It's okay. It's all right.
And I was totally running about like an idiot, trying to remember where to post everything, and I missed out.
I got it off the Facebook page.
I was on Quantum Overlord's, post Magic Sandwich show tonight, which lasted 2 hours, and we spoke for almost another hour. And I was the one mostly speaking, so I already spoke for 3 hours almost, and I just. But
I need to remember. It's just tonight was just chaotic.
Yeah, I didn't watch it because I was in the other one, but.
I fell asleep. I've been walking about the Royal Highlands show yesterday all day, and I ate my way from one end of the showground to the other. So I'm bound to be a bit stone heavier. And
well, I just wanted to apologize to you. I just wanted to apologize because I was going to try to get myself spanked into a corner again this time, but I'm just far too tired tonight to do anything silly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But this has actually made me think about next week. What we can discuss next week. And I think it's going to be something along the lines of bluebirds. In that there will be bluebirds over the white cliffs of Dover. Intelligent design.
Why?
I think that might be an interesting one.
Earlier when you guys were talking about the radiometric dating, I wanted to bring up something I put in here, which is zircons.
Yes.
That's how they figured out how the Earth is at least the 3 billion years.
Weren't those from meteorites?
They were. But essentially, if you could figure, there were one specific for Earth. If you could figure out how old these zircons were, you could figure out how old meteors were. And there was meteors that were from Earth when it was in its early formation. Essentially, when certain meteors hit Earth, it blew apart, fractions of Earth.
Yeah, I mentioned that there was a science show on YouTube that actually covered this, the oldest objects in the world, and they showed it in the vial. Actually, they had dissolved the rock, and the diamonds are basically all that are left over, and it's just kind of like this grayish suspension in the liquid. But that's how they actually happen to date those meteorites, and they come from another star, because you can't get that without being forged in the furnace of a star.
Yeah.
which make them the oldest things and, in a sense, the most valuable things ever found on the face of the earth. I'll have to get the link. It was a science presenter. She's very good, actually. But I'll have to, if I find the link again, I'll post it. It's too late now. I'm going to sleep soon. But I'm like a kid in a candy store because I got a new phone today. My other phone broke literally today while I was going to go and look at other phones. So it must have known. After 4 years, the poor thing decided I was going to chuck it out. So I had to get a new phone. And so I did. I got an iPhone 4S for now until the next few months when the 6 comes out. So I've been playing with it and setting it up all night long. There you go. That's the reason why I'm up. And with that, I killed the conversation again.
No, Fiona had to step away for a moment.
Oh, okay. Oh, I didn't.
And I'm still looking up Hawk's genes. That is so fascinating.
I was actually looking at Bod's comment on this thing. He's saying something similar. It was about an hour ago, but he's saying something similar to, "Oh, if these are arming for us, but they will just confuse they will do nothing to confuse the creationists, who will simply pull the goalpost back." And which his point was that, oh, you figure out how chemistry makes biology. Now, where does the physics come from? Which, if they actually admit to that applying or happening, they basically gotten rid of the early models of creation, because that process takes a very long time to stew in bubble in order to get the proper chemicals. So, you've gotten them somewhere to where they're only pondering about the beginning of the universe. So, with that, you could let them stay, because nobody knows that just yet.
Yeah, no, I mean, exactly. And we may never know. Who knows if our descendants will, but we may never know. So, yeah, let them have it, but they can't posit scientific things to the creation. Okay, if they want to take a stance that it is a god, you can't make science up to justify that. It is a matter of faith, and as Fiona said, that's a legitimate and honest stance to take, if that's what you believe. But you cannot make up your own facts to justify that belief. I mean,
call it science, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's dishonest. It's completely dishonest. If somebody like Fiona says, she believes in God and it's her faith and etc., but she fully accepts science, I don't have a problem with that. Okay, I don't, because she's not making anything up to try to tell people how the world is. She's not misinforming anybody. She's just, she has something which I don't have, but I understand that's something personal to her. I don't have a problem with that. But when creationists and fundamentalists start making stuff up to try to impose their view on the world, and then to claim that none of their faith would make sense without every single word being true, well, that just speaks to the lack of solidity in their faith, and that also tells you just how dishonest they're being to try to make it come true. It's just a ridiculous position to take. And an insulting one, frankly. And not only insulting to me, but insulting to people of faith who do accept science and see no problem with that.
Yeah. A while back, we were talking about how people claim that Fiona is an atheist because she talks about the science and stuff like that. Well, I went through something similar, but on the other end, and Nate knows this because he runs the group that this conversation happened to have. This group that the conversation took place. And what was funny is that I was actually trying to legitimately answer the questions that some other atheists were asking, the unanswered questions that a Christian can't answer, which I thought was ridiculous. It's like, yeah, they can answer some of those questions, and I decided to take it upon myself. And even though I never said what I was, nor did I pretend to be something else, I just never corrected them on it. They assumed I was a Christian. Not only that, because they couldn't refute my argument nor my points that were valid and well established, they called me a stupid young Christian, and oh, look at that stupid young Christian, and then kicked me from being able to contact them anymore.
Well, no, I mean, there are plenty of stupid atheists who arrive at their atheism through stupid means. Let's be honest.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, there's that one caller on the Atheist Experience calls every 6 months or so trying to say that gay marriage is an abomination, even though he's an atheist. And Matt continually hangs up on him. I mean, they had it out a few times a few years ago, and he just keeps trying every now and then. So it's you got atheists of all stripes. All it means is you just don't believe in God, but it doesn't mean you're intellectual or you arrived at that conclusion in an honest or inquisitive manner. It just means you don't believe in God. Hell, I mean, Raelians are atheists. And Raelians are about as far from, in my view, rational thinking people as you can get. They just replace a god with an alien, and genetic engineering, and then lots of free love and thrown in, and who knows what else, and that's their religion. I mean, but they are atheists. They don't believe in a god. So they. Yeah, you don't have to be smart to be an atheist. But I would also say that in somewhat in defense of those atheists, but even though I don't know the specifics, etc. But it is true that most interactions online, which take place between believers and non-believers, are from the extreme camp of believers like Nephilim Free type or Seitan Bruggen types and Eric Hovind types, who basically you don't hear much from the moderates trying to explain things. You mostly do hear from the extremists, the idiots. And so when somebody defends certain Christian concepts, it's wrong, but it's usually assumed, I'm guessing, that they are an evangelical or fundamentalist, etc.
Yeah.
So it's a faulty judgment, and it's erroneous to do that. But just from experience alone, that's almost always the kind of person who is defending, who is practicing apologetics online, for sure.
Well, yeah, and I could do the apologetic stuff probably better than some of the other people. And as far as the evangelicals go, I can actually explain a lot of the stuff, mostly because I understand it, and I don't have a box that I'll stay in when I try to explain it.
Well, yeah, it's like you actually rarely hear from agnostics, pure agnostics. You mostly hear from atheists. If you start defending any sort of position from science, etc., people will automatically assume that you are an atheist because it's mostly atheists that are doing that online. So again, that's also an erroneous position to take, and we've all railed against it. But yeah, that is, from their point of view, I'm guessing that is mostly what they experience online. Is atheists are the ones posting the science memes, and you know, religious fundamentalists are the ones posting, you know, the faith memes. So it's
which
it's
I've actually done on my Google Plus a couple of times, where I posted quotes from the Bible because it was fun. Because I was trying to make a point. It's like, you know, you live by this book. You talk about it, but you don't actually, you don't understand what something in it actually either means, or you don't even know the verse that I'm talking about. It's not like I'm talking about a verse that's far out there. It's something that Jesus said, and it's from the actual, you know, one of the first 4 Gospels, which is the first books you're supposed to read when you get to the New Testament.
Yeah.
So it's fun. It's fun because they don't realize that stuff's in there.
Yeah, I know it's true. I mean, most Christians have not really read the Bible. At least not the ones I've met. Most of them. It's different with people like G-Man and Beckel and a few others.
I mean, they claim to have read it, but when you bring up a simple verse, not something construed or something, you know, oh, this is Proverbs 19,852 in section Article B, Part 4. No, it's like in Matthew Gospel 1, verse 1. It says this.
Yeah, well, again, most Christians I've ever met never actually read the Bible cover to cover.
Welcome back, Fiona.
If I can introduce myself, hi, I'm Nate. I'm a Christian.
Hey,
I read
Nate.
the Bible cover to cover.
I know, but Nate, nobody ever accused you of being that kind of.
You're 4,000 years old. Crap! I can't even. 6,000. My bad.
I was just out feeding the horses.
Can't even do that right.
And now that Fiona's back, to comment on what the other guy was saying on how he believes that the Earth is 6,000 years. No, not 6,000. That the creation of the universe is 6,000. No, 6 days. Yeah. 6 days. The way in which I justify that when I was a Christian, in my head was going, well, what's a day to God? What planet is he orbiting? Even though Nathaniel will probably note that they actually meant literally 6 rotations of the Earth. But when you're looking at, say, God, what planet's he rotating? What sun is going down? What Earth is he on that's spinning around?
Yeah, I don't think that they actually meant that literally at first, at least. I mean, I don't think that, the ancient Greeks thought that, No, I don't think that, like, the ancient Greeks actually thought that Athena actually sprang from Zeus's head, etc. There are certain stories that arise from a culture in that kind of time, which you don't know if they took it literally, and they probably didn't. They probably were just telling a story, and who knows? But my guess is that it was a story to them, not to be taken literally. It was later that people started taking it literally, but I think that there's clear evidence that, sociologically speaking, that is not actually how myths occur. It's not somebody just coming up with this crazy story and everybody's like, oh, we believe it. People aren't that gullible. It becomes a tradition, and the tradition of telling the story becomes more important than the actual facts behind the story, and that's when it gets codified into a religious experience, into a religious process, the actual ceremony of it, and the identity of it. It's not, if there are tribes in the rainforest and in Africa that would kind of equate that level of learning at that time period we're talking about, that in existence today, and they wouldn't just accept a story, a new story out of the blue about the creation of the universe, in another wacky way as fact. I mean, it doesn't start off like that. Human beings don't just tell a story and everybody around them absolutely believes it instantly. That's not how it happens.
Well, if I may give credence to that, you know how Superman is a fictional character?
Yeah.
I know some people who ponder or think about, well, what if Superman was real? And they try to figure out how the physics works or something like that, or make it real in their head.
Yeah, but you cannot compare it to our Western society. We have long moved beyond that point. We are no longer. We don't sit around the campfire every single night and tell stories as our only means of entertainment and identity. Our stories are so temporary that people back then would not have been able to understand that kind of concept of time that we have today. So it's very difficult. You can find cultures where they do still practice those kind of traditions, but they are far and few in between and extremely isolated. But they have been studied, and from them we do understand the way in which these kind of societies evolve and practice their beliefs and how their beliefs originate. And again, they also, while they may have stories that are myths that they believe, they also tell fantastical stories that they don't take at face value, that they don't believe are real, that could later turn into stories which they take literally. But it's more of an expression of their identity and their sense of humor, their sense of politics, their, the sense of storytelling, of love, whatever, that is the most important aspect of these stories. It's only later, due to politics and tradition, really, it's the tradition of telling the story, the tradition of it being retold, that really becomes seen as fact.
Yeah.
I was going to bounce back to the 6 days of creation right quick. Some people get the idea that like a day could have been an indefinite bit of time or time length instead of a literal day. There was a verse in 2 Peter 3:8, and this might kind of lead to that. Do not forget this one thing, dear friends. With the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years. 1,000 years like a day. Some people could point to that and say it wasn't really a literal day.
Yeah, but you see,
1,000 years or an indefinite period of time.
No, people who do that are wrong. People who point to that and use that as an example are wrong, because that verse was written 1,000 years, at the very least, 1,000 years after the story of Genesis. Okay, so it's like saying. It's like taking a myth from 1000 AD and then writing something about it today, saying this is what was meant by it, but with no reference point to whatsoever. Because remember, they didn't have libraries you could go to check up the discoveries of other letters and other writings on. They were going by themselves, stories and traditions. Okay, so they really didn't have any knowledge about what people 1,000 years before them really thought. And in fact, they knew nothing about these people. We know far more about these people than the people did around 2,000 years ago. We know far more about the people who lived 3,000 years ago than the people who were closer to them, because they didn't have research, they didn't have historical tools, they didn't have science to tell them about these people. They were going on oral traditions, so they are just as much in the dark as people who lived 1,000 years previously. So you cannot point to that verse and say, well, that's what they meant. That surely that's what because Peter got it right. Because Peter didn't know. Peter had no idea. He had less idea than you do, and that's saying something right there. No, because you're not an expert in sociology of the time or archaeology of the time. Neither am I. So for us to know more than Peter did is already telling, frankly.
No, my point was, I mean, I know you had a lot to say about this, but my point is, some people can look at that and kind of use that to validate whether they're right or wrong. It doesn't matter, but people could be completely wrong, but they will use something like that.
Yeah, but it's a complete point. I understand, but it's a complete misunderstanding.
I mean, that's all I was saying.
Yeah.
I'm still wondering about the bluebirds and the cliffs of Dover.
Yeah, I was wondering that myself, actually. I have to admit.
What, you were wondering what that's about?
Yeah.
It's gotta be.
You're kidding me. Dover, Pennsylvania.
Well, I know what the cliffs of Dover are, and bluebirds, but how do they?
Dover, Pennsylvania.
Oh.
Okay.
I'm lost.
Yeah. I've been to
You
Dover.
are kidding me. 2005.
What does that have to do with
Design on
bluebirds?
tile.
Yeah, Kitzmiller versus Dover.
Oh, I thought you was talking about actual limestone cliffs somewhere. Okay.
I was saying that an idea for next week.
Yeah, they should just mine those cliffs in Dover.
Yeah.
I'm up with you now.
For next
National
week,
treasure, smational treasure, mine it for the chalk. It's valuable resource. Let's just cut it away.
Yes. But yeah, for next week's discussion, I think that might be an interesting one, because we have been concentrating on the Bible and science, and it might be interesting to now bring intelligent design into it. Because intelligent design began as a religious position. It has moved from that now. And it's desperately trying to shrug off the creationist mantle that it was dressed in. So I think I'm going to draw this to a close, because we've been on here for God knows how long.
And I gotta go to sleep too.
Yeah. And I've got a load of things to catch up with, because I slept earlier on. I've missed everything. I'm not going to do an after show tonight, because I'm shattered. But I think next week we will look at. I think it might be interesting to have a retrospective on Kitzmiller versus Dover area scroll board.
Did you watch the? Did you watch the Nova series from PBS?
Oh yeah, I did more than that. I read the transcripts as they came out.
Yeah, I followed it. Yeah, I followed it as well when it was happening.
Yeah,
very
I was every night coming in from work and looking for the next transcript.
Yeah, I remember doing that.
It was absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
I
used to get them from Richard Dawkins' site, I believe, at the time.
Yeah. Well, I was actually going on to the court site, and the court was putting up the transcripts.
Yeah, I know, but somebody was posting them on a website I was a member of, like, every night. That's
very, very good. So, I think that's what we'll do. We'll look at Dover next week. And I think that the week after is going to maybe be the repercussions of Dover, or intelligent design now.
Yeah.
That might be quite an interesting one. But anyway, I want to thank you for joining me tonight. It's not been quite as coherent, because I still haven't woken up from my accidental snooze.
After we sign out, I want to show you something, Fiona.
All right. Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
No. It's a comment I wrote. Thank you very much.
Right. So I'll just thank everybody for joining me. Thank my watchers, and I hope that somebody gets something out of this one. Well,
Yeah,
good night,
don't worry.
everybody.
I'll show Fiona that same stuff that Fiona thought Neathena was going to show her. I'll show her that stuff all day, all night.
Right. So say bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.